beneath the surface of history, beyond every map we've ever drawn, lingers a question we can't quite shake. What if some ancient civilizations never actually disappeared? What if they didn't collapse, but stepped back and watched? Imagine powerful societies retreating into the shadows, untouched by time. From ruined temples swallowed by vines to ancient scrolls hinting at sky cities and vast underground worlds, there's no smoking gun, but the signs refuse to stay silent. Strange patterns in the archaeological record, timelines that don't quite line up, cultures that seem to appear out of nowhere, too complex, too fast, technologies that defy the tools of their time, and vanishings so precise they can't be chalked up to war or weather. Could these lost worlds still be hidden today, tucked away in the most remote corners of the earth, buried beneath oceans, sealed inside uncharted mountains, or lying silent under deserts, waiting? Civilizations that may have once ruled the world and, maybe, in some hidden way, still do. The clues are scattered, the mysteries still unsolved. So sit back, take a breath and let's dive into one of the most chilling possibilities of all. What if some ancient civilizations never really left us? In the heart of Central America, surrounded by layers of cloud, forest and tangled vines, lies another mystery that has been whispered about for centuries. The locals refer to it as La Ciudad Blanca, the White City, while others know it as the Lost City of the Monkey God. Here, in the unexplored depths of the Mesquite jungle of eastern Honduras, the rainforest breathes like a living wall, its thick canopy swallowing light, noise, and time. This is behind the drifting sands of Arabia and the ghost of Uber. Many people believe that beneath this green labyrinth is a forgotten civilization that has not been seen, is untouched, and may not be completely lost. The terrain is dangerous, mountains of slippery stone, choking vegetation, rivers swollen with rain, and insects that have never known human fear. La Ciudad Blanca was first mentioned in writing in the early 16th century when Spanish conquistadors heard tales of a city glistening with white stone deep within the jungle. The city was said to be rich beyond belief, adorned with idols of gold, and a people who vanished without a trace. However, unlike the great Maya or Inca ruins, no conclusive evidence ever emerged. No standing temples, no deciphered script, and number empire recorded in the annals of history, just stories passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, reinforced by the thick jungle curtain that kept would-be explorers at bay for centuries. These tales persisted as local legend, which many people dismissed as folklore. But the forest has a memory and doesn't forget as easily as we might think. When a group of American and Hindu researchers scanned the Mesquite from the air in 2012, using LiDAR light detection and ranging technology, they discovered a complex network of roads, plazas, mounds, and other clearly artificial structures hidden beneath the trees. This was the first time science had seen what the locals had always thought was there. And in 2015, an expedition into one of the mapped sites confirmed it. Archaeologists discovered an incredible collection of stone sculptures, carvings, and ceremonial seats that resembled half human and half animal figures. These artifacts were unlike anything found in known Mesoamerican cultures, and they appeared to have been hastily abandoned as though the inhabitants had abruptly left. Who were these people, and why did they disappear? More interestingly, the location was not a part of any known empire and lacked the characteristics of the Maya, Aztec, or OM civilizations. It was culturally unique, indicating the existence of a civilization that evolved separately, perhaps in isolation. Could this have been a secret society that stayed apart from its more well-known neighbors, one that either chose or was compelled to vanish from the mainstream? Many problems still need to be answered, but archaeology today believes that this location was a part of an unidentified but highly developed society that flourished sometime between 1100 and 1400 AD. If the city is white, it is not completely white. The impressive buildings are partially buried, and the intricate carvings are still uninterpreted. Could this have been one of many cities, a lone outpost in a larger kingdom still covered in jungle? And then there are the older, stranger tales. Indigenous tribes in the area have long spoken of a cursed city where those who enter do not return. Throughout the 20th century, explorers claim to have seen flashes of white stone through the trees, only to be driven back by disease, terrain, or unexplained misfortune. There were rumors of temples guarded by monkeys, shrines deep in caverns, and artifacts found and then lost. Some say the city moves, while others claim it reveals itself, only when it chooses to. Could this be just myth layered on mystery, or is the jungle itself hiding something more? After all, the Mesquite remains one of the least mapped places on Earth, even with modern tools. The terrain is so hostile that many regions have never been visited by archaeologists. What might still be beyond the reach of satellites and LAR scans? Some fringe theories even contend that the city was purposefully concealed rather than abandoned with its inhabitants, possibly terrified of spiritual doom or conquest, disappearing into the ground or the jungle itself, leaving only their stone warnings and no remains or bones behind. Despite the conjecture, the jungle remains unresponsive, providing only hints such as stone shapes beneath roots, broken statues cradled by moss, paved causeways swallowed by earth, and stories of civilizations that fled underground or into alternate planes when the world above changed. Other theorists compare the city to Amazonian legends of cities of gold and sacred sites guarded by forest spirits. As we drift north from the humid forest, the forest is patient, and maybe so is the truth. Was Blanca the center of a vanished kingdom, or were the people who lived there part of a larger civilization still sleeping beneath the vines, their secrets intact, their descendants perhaps living in plain sight under new names with old memories sealed in ritual, beyond the windswept extremity of the Cornish peninsula? Another narrative emerges about a kingdom that is claimed to have flourished in full, with the land ending in craggy cliffs and the sea rolling in with an ancient cadence. View of the mainland. Before the ocean swallowed it whole, they called it Lioness to stand at Land's End, or on the weathered cliffs of Penzance and look out toward the Isles of Scilly, is to face the same waters that according to local law once flowed through the streets of a thriving kingdom, a land of green fields, 140 churches, golden towers rising above the waves, a kingdom lost not to time or war but to water. In a single cataclysmic night, the tale of Linus appears throughout British folklore and Arthurian legend. In some versions, it was the home of Tristan, one of King Arthur's most trusted knights. In others, it is a land of noble houses, doomed by hubris or cursed by fate, but always the story ends the same way: the earth trembled, the sea surged, and the kingdom was lost beneath the waves. Survivors, if any, were few. Some say only one man escaped on horseback, riding ahead of the rising tide. It would be easy to dismiss Lioness as pure myth, another romantic tragedy carved into the cultural memory of medieval Europe, and yet the story lingers in an oddly persistent way. Locals in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly have spoken for generations of stone walls, Visible beneath the water during low tide, fishermen have claimed to hear the faint sound of bells. Tolling beneath the sea, some divers have even reported glimpses of submerged structures. Is it just the imagination looking for things where none exist? Or may these be the last remains of something that once stood on dry land? Rectangular shapes, upright stones, and patterns in the sea floor that don't seem completely natural. Modern geology adds yet another layer of intrigue. During the last ice age, when sea levels were drastically lower, much of what is now the Celtic Sea would have been dry land, fertile plains that stretched between Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. As the glaciers melted and the oceans rose, this land would have gradually disappeared beneath the waterline. Paleogeographic reconstructions demonstrate that Mesolithic people actually lived in these areas. As evidence of settlements, tools, and burial sites has been found not far from this submerged shelf. Could Lyoness have been a memory of this lost landscape that was embellished over the centuries into a tale of kingdoms and kings? Perhaps, but some details remain unexplained because of how accurate the legends are. A geographical mass west of Cornwall that no longer exists is frequently depicted on old Cornish maps. The poet Thomas Malory, writing in the 15th century, refers to Lyoness as a real place, not allegory, and even earlier in the chronicles of Geoffrey of Monmouth, there are mentions of western lands lost to the sea. It is rare for so many sources separated by time and geography to converge so clearly on a single idea. Then there are the stories from the Isles of Scilly themselves. Inhabitants there have long maintained that their islands were once connected in a single land mass, larger, greener, and more populated. Some archaeological surveys suggest that settlements once stretched across now submerged regions, fields, and hedge seen from the air or traced by sonar hint at organized agricultural systems beneath the waves. These aren't just the products of imagination, they are patterns that provoke questions. Could a Bronze Age or even Iron Age civilization have existed in this region, developed beyond our current understanding, and then been gradually and violently lost to the encroaching sea? There is no written record of such a people. There are no names or artifacts that can be conclusively linked to a kingdom of Leon. But the Atlantic has never been kind to preservation. Storms, currents, and centuries of sediment bury more than just sand. They erase, conceal, and still the sea speaks in moments of perfect calm when the tide recedes far beyond its usual reach. Some claim to have seen the tops of stone buildings, half buried in kelp and shadow, while others who are walking the beaches near Moration or Mounts Bay have reported finding stone-paved walkways or the remnants of old roads that disappear into the water. There is no agreement, only a persistent, silently unresolved accounts that persist. We may never know for sure, but as the Atlantic churns and the wind presses against the Cornish cliffs, the question of what lies beneath the waves, who remembers what was lost, and as the mists linger, the story of a sudden deluge may be a cultural memory of a slow-moving catastrophe that collapsed into a single night in the minds of those who lived through its aftermath. Or could it be that a real kingdom, unknown to official history, once ruled these now drunk lands, leaving behind only whispers and the ghost of a bell beneath the tide? The Empty Quarter, also known as the Rub al Khali, is one of the planet's most hostile regions, where the sun burns the soil with ancient rage and the wind creates ripples across infinite dunes. An ocean of sand, wide and silent, unforgiving, not investigated. However, behind its silence, rumors of a long-lost metropolis linger. Iram of the Pillars was formerly a kingdom. Others refer to it as the Atlantis of the Sands, or Uber. This would appear to the uninformed eye to be just another windswept desert legend, However, Iram, a city with tall pillars that had never been constructed anywhere else, is mentioned in the Quran as well. According to Islamic belief, the inhabitants of D were a strong, haughty civilization whose disobedience was met with divine wrath. Their civilization was completely engulfed by a tremendous sandstorm which wiped it off the face of the planet. Iram was merely a moral story for millennia, a myth to caution against arrogance. However, the distinction between myth and reality started to become less clear in the 1990s. A network of historic trade routes traces, left by generations of caravans transporting spices, gold, and frankincense around the Arabian Peninsula, was charted by scientists using NASA satellite photos. Archaeologists discovered the remnants of a village, including deep underground chambers, collapsed limestone wells, and defended walls, at a crucial intersection close to a location known as Shissa. It was a physical discovery, actual, before long, a lot of people thought they had located Uba, the legendary city, Iram of the Pillars, maybe. Around the world, word of the discovery spread. Had the myth always been real? Was there an Uba hidden under millennia of shifting sand? There were even indications that the site had abruptly collapsed, maybe due to a sinkhole, or ... another thing. Was this the divine retribution mentioned in the old scriptures, which science is now translating? There are still unanswered questions. Dating from the first millennium BC, the remains were probably a crucial station for the incense trade and possibly even a tiny metropolis. However, the scale is small. The huge pillars, where are they? The palaces, where is the majesty of a city that is reputed to be among the best in the world? Perhaps Uba was never a single location. Perhaps it was a collective memory, a patchwork of outposts that gradually came to be one legend through the stories of travelers. And what happened if Uba fell? Some academics attribute the inability to survive to natural factors, including moving dunes, dwindling aquifers, and a changing climate. Others blame the breakdown of trade, internal decline, or conflict. However, those are merely conjectures, puzzle pieces without edges, not sure. The strangest stories follow. Far down in the desert, local Bedouins talk of half-buried ruined structures that emerge following sandstorms and then disappear once more. There are legends of pillars emerging from the ground and then being engulfed by the sun. Wanderers who disappeared off the map and never returned. No evidence, no proof. Silence, however, is a good keeper of secrets in the desert. Is there anything else hidden beneath the dunes? Whole regions of a vanished kingdom, unaltered, waiting for technology to find them, or for time. The empty quarter is still one of the least visited locations on Earth. Under its shifting skin, what might still be sleeping? Even more extreme are certain fringe notions that are fueled by mystery but rejected by scholars. According to them, Uba might not have been completely human, that its abrupt descent and disastrous decline are reminiscent of old tales from all over the world, light-based civilizations that vanished in a flash. According to some, Uba was a part of a far wider, lost network of highly developed desert cultures that existed long before their names were formally recorded in history. It remains to be seen if these theories are irrational, conjecture, or secret realities. However, Göbekli Tepe was buried for 12,000 years before being discovered in the world we live in, where, year after year, ancient cities continue to emerge from the dust, and where every dig blurs the boundary between the inevitable and the impossible. Thus, we go back to the sand, the silence, and the tales that the stone and wind have taught us. Was Uber real? Or is it merely an echo, a representation of all that time has robbed us of? And if that was true, would it be out there yet, beneath 1,000 years of desert breath, waiting? The sands might still be observing, and maybe the pillars are prepared to rise once more. Dust of Quivera and Sabila fades into the winds of the Great Plains. We shift now to an island of dense forests, ancient temples, and tangled myth, a place where civilization has risen and fallen in layers, and where something far stranger may have once walked among us. We arrive in Sri Lanka, tropical, verdant, and teeming with life, but in the hidden corners of its jungles, long before the modern world reached shores, legends whispered of a different kind of people. They were called the Nati. To the Sinhale and Veda people, two of Sri Lanka's oldest known ethnic groups, the Nateo were not just creatures of folklore, but remembered beings small in stature. Covered in reddish hair and walking upright like humans, they were described as agile, nocturnal, and fiercely territorial. Some say they used simple tools, hunted small game, and lived in caves. Others recall more chilling details: that they did not speak, that they fought with claws, and that their existence ended in violence and fear. But who or what were they? The earliest accounts come not from modern anthropology, but from oral history in the eastern regions of Sri Lanka, especially near the harsh and remote jungles of Mahoya and the Danagala Plateau. Elders tell of the last days of the Natibo. According to VA tradition, the Natibo were exterminated roughly 2 centuries ago. The story goes that after years of increasing conflict with nearby tribes, the Vedas finally cornered the last of the Nitu, believed to be around 20 individuals, into a narrow rock cleft. They then sealed the entrance with boulders, leaving them to die within it. Is a disturbing account, but is it merely a cautionary tale, or a record of a real event in the late 19th century British colonial? Officials and explorers began collecting stories about the Nateo. The most notable among them was Hugh Neville, a civil servant and ethnologist who spent years studying Sri Lanka's indigenous cultures. He took the reports seriously, recording descriptions that were consistent across different regions. Other officials, such as British Judge Frederick Lewis, published essays in scientific journals detailing what appeared to be credible testimony from locals who claimed their grandparents had seen the Nitya with their own eyes. Skeptics have long dismissed these reports as folklore, possibly a misremembered encounter with wild animals, or confusion between the Nyawo and primitive tribes living in isolation. But others have pointed out the consistency in physical description and behavior. This was not a story passed down with exaggeration and flourish. Rather, it was told plainly and with unnerving clarity. Could the Nitwo have been a surviving offshoot of an archaic human lineage? Although Sri Lanka and Flores are separated by a significant distance of ocean, ancient maritime dispersals across Southeast Asia are no longer regarded as Could a cousin species of Homo sapiens have survived in the forests of Sri Lanka into the 18th or even 19th century, unknown to the world but known only to those who lived beside them? There is another, more unsettling possibility. Some researchers have hypothesized that the Nateo might have been a relic population of Homo florensis, the so-called hobbits of Indonesia, whose fossil remains were discovered on the island of Flores in 2003. What if the Niti weren't completely human? According to some VA legends, they were more beast than man, unable to speak, covered in thick fur, and attacked prey with animalistic savagery. They were also said to sleep in trees, jump across ravines, and disappear into thicket faster than any hunter could follow. Could these characteristics indicate an undiscovered primate, a bipedal hominid native to the island that is now extinct or may still be hidden in the deeper reaches of the jungle. No satellite has yet been found, and despite modern times, a significant portion of Sri Lanka's interior has remained largely unexplored. The eastern forests are especially rough, with many limestone caverns, deep gorges, and thick undergrowth. Despite the use of cutting-edge equipment, the terrain, politics, and financial constraints hinder the hunt for evidence. Strange finds have been recovered from a few amateur trips. None of it is definitive, but it hasn't been explained completely. Claw scratches on tree trunks, unknown hair samples, and footprints that differ from those of any known primate in the absence of definitive DNA samples or photographic proof of skeletal remains. MAINSTREAM, science is still dubious. What if the Nateo are still out there, not as ghosts, but as survivors hiding in places we haven't yet visited, or perhaps in the memories of those who were the last to see them? The idea is not so readily dismissed in the peaceful parts of Sri Lanka, where the air is thick with the sound of insects and the forest hums with unseen movement. Drawing the boundary between history and mythology is not always simple, particularly when the forest conceals itself so effectively and from the dark. Jungles of Sri Lanka, where the last echoes of the Nateo disappear into the mystery of the Ototalan culture and the lands they occupied, stretching across modern-day Naritsinaloa, is that lifts from Lake Wadvita, and the echoes of the Moisa still whisper through the Andean winds as we drift northwest into the fertile valleys and rugged coasts of western Mexico, where rivers wind through jungle and volcanic slopes fall away to the Pacific. Traces of a civilization once described as both a cultural bridge and a phantom kingdom remain. A people remembered not for how the landscape of Jaliscoco and portions of Durango is made up of highlands, mangroves, and riverbanks. Aztlan. Settlements grew up alongside rivers like the Rio Santiago and Rio San Pedro, frequently encircled by thick vegetation and changing terrain. The atmosphere is humid, full of the smell of rain and earth, and alive with the sounds of life, but it keeps its secrets well. Time and the forest have combined to permanently erase what once stood here. Aztlan is regarded by archaeologists as a tradition rather than a centralized empire, a network of interconnected city-states and communities that shared language, customs, and trade between approximately 900 and 1358. They are renowned for their colorful ceramics and turquoise inlaid ornaments, as well as their involvement in one of the biggest pre-Columbian North American trade systems, which involved the movement of goods from as far away as central Mexico and the American Southwest through Aztlan hands. Obsidian cacao, seashells feathers, jade copper. This was not a remote tribe. Rather, it was a moving civilization, but a lot about them is still unknown. The name Aztlan itself has a strange resonance in Nahal, meaning place of herons, but it also sounds eerily similar for another reason. According to Aztec origin myths, Alan, spelled nearly identically, was the mysterious homeland from which the Mexica or Aztecs once migrated before founding. Tenochtitlan, a land of white reeds, lakes, and temples, a land that has never been found, is. This coincidence of names merely linguistic drift, or is it a clue? Could the Ototalan culture have been the last echo of that mythical homeland, forgotten by time, preserved only in scattered ceramics and oral tradition? We know that the Aztecs believed Olon lay to the northwest, and we know that the Aztlan region falls squarely within that direction. The geographic overlap is tantalizing, even more so when we consider that the cultural traits of the Aztlan people, ceremonial ball courts, tiered platform-specific burial practices, bear a resemblance to those seen in both northern and central Mesoamerican civilizations, they seem to occupy a liminal space, neither entirely northern nor southern, a cultural crossroads. And then around the 14th century, the Ostatlan tradition disappears. Archaeological layers expand. Silent settlements are abandoned. Pottery styles disappear. Trade slows. And no written record remains to explain why the Aztlan people moved, blending in with other populations, migrating inland or southward to become a part of the newly emerging Aztec Empire, or why it was war, drought, or disease. Some scholars suggest that the Aztlan were absorbed into the larger Nahua-speaking populations that came to dominate Central Mexico. Others believe they fragmented into smaller, less centralized groups, but none of these theories can fully explain the suddenness of their disappearance or the lingering presence of their influence, because something remains in certain towns along the rivers of Narit. Oral histories still speak of ancestral cities, now swallowed by jungle in ceremonial centers. Like Chacala and Elon del Rio, unexplained structures hint at knowledge-lost. Petroglyphs appear on remote rock faces, symbols whose meanings are still debated. Some of the glyphs match those seen hundreds of kilometers away. Were these part of a sacred writing system, or signs left for those who knew how to read the land? And then there is the speculative, those who believe the Otatlan culture may not have vanished entirely, but retreated into hidden valleys, into caves, into other names and identities. There are local legends of people who left not because they were defeated, but because they chose to disappear. Some connect them to the Chicha, others to wandering priestly castes, said to have traveled with knowledge from a time before cities. A few fringe theories even link Aztlan to the broader idea of lost mother cultures. According to these interpretations, the name Aztlan refers not only to a geographical area, but also to a crucial linguistic artifact that points back to a primordial homeland that we have not yet discovered, which could be located beneath floodplains, volcanic ash, or our presumptions. These hypothetical ancient civilizations are thought to have been the ancestors of the known Mesoamerican empires. As usual, the truth is still elusive. We do know that the Aztlan culture connected north and south, past and future, and that they stood at the edge of myth and memory. They left behind a trail of faint impressions, rather than ruins or monuments, that spread widely across a landscape that was still reluctant to give up its past. This leaves us wondering not only about the identity of the Aztlan, but also about where they might have gone. Were they the stewards of a forgotten migration, a culture that chose to disappear rather than be subdued? Or are they still there in name, blood, and ritual, waiting for us to see them not as a mystery but as a message from a time when the rivers still flow as the echoes of Aztlan creep westward beyond the boundaries of the map? The heron may still be there somewhere between myth and map, more carefully. They may still be. Our eyes move eastward across the wind-dark waters of the Ion as we watch the winds die down along Sardinia's craggy shores, and the last echoes of the Shardana fade into the sea. Rising from the northern edge of the sea is a quiet island that is frequently missed by modern eyes. It is Lemnos, rugged, windswept, and steeped in myth, and it holds a secret that has baffled historians for more than a century. A faint fragmentary whisper from a time before the Greeks, before the myths had names, a vanished people who are now only known at first glance as the Lemnian culture. With its olive groves, dispersed villages, and crumbling fortresses, Lemnos appears to be just another island in the northern Ion. But beneath the surface, something strange remains. In 1885, workers discovered a stone that was remarkably flat, weathered, and engraved with writing near Kamia. This was unlike anything that had ever been seen on the island, which is now known as the Lemnian. The artifact was a silent shock to the archaeological community. The language was not Greek. Rather, it was very close to Etruscan, the enigmatic, pre-Roman Italian dialect whose origins have long eluded a clear explanation. Although Lemnos is hundreds of miles away from Tuscany, separated by sea, culture, and time, the characters etched into the stone matched the Etruscan script. The grammar, and even the names suggested a connection. How could a script so closely associated with central Italy appear on an island called Ion centuries before Roman influence? Although the Lemnian stela is typically dated to the 6th century BC, the culture that it conveys about the people who carved that stone and inscribed those lines is still obscure. No other significant inscriptions from this group have been discovered on Lemnos. There are no extensive ruins, no tombs bearing engraved names, just pottery fragments and hints of settlement. And this single text stands like a sentinel over lost memory. So, who were the Lemnians? One theory is that they were part of a larger pre-Greek substrate, a wave of settlers who arrived in the Ion before Hellenic civilization took root. Perhaps they were Western seafarers traveling across the Mediterranean, long before the rise of classical city-states. If so, their relationship to the Etruscans may indicate a shared origin or, at the very least, sustained contact between cultures that are often thought to be isolated. However, there is also the possibility that Lemnos was one of the last outposts of a civilization older than both Greece and Etruria, a bridge between East and West, preserved on a windswept island long enough for a few words to endure. Mainstream historians continue to exercise caution. Some argue that the Lemnian script's resemblance to Etruscan is a result of parallel development or an artifact of trade. Others suggest that Etruscan merchants or mercenaries settled temporarily on Lemnos, bringing their language with them, and yet the presence of a local dialect and a distinct culture suggests something deeper than a passing visit. Further complicating the picture are the island's mythological associations. In Greek tradition, Lemnos is a place of exile and estrangement. It was said to be the domain of Hephaestus, god of fire and forge, who was cast from Olympus and landed here. Wounded and broken, the island was later described in myth as being inhabited by the Centaurs, a people known for their strange language. Homer himself referred to Lemnos as the land of the wild speak-aching men. Could these stories be faint memories of a real people, those who spoke a tongue foreign even to the Greeks and whose culture had already begun to fade by the time the myths were written? Some fringe theories have speculated that the Lemnians were remnants of a proto-Mediterranean civilization, one that predated the Indo-European migration and left scattered fingerprints across the ancient world. Others have drawn connections to the sea peoples or even to lost cultures submerged beneath the rising seas at the end of the last ice age. These ideas remain speculative, but the mystery endures. The most striking thing about the Lemnian stele is how little we understand about it. Its language is still not fully understood, and its meaning, whether it refers to a grave, a dedication, or a political statement, is only partially translated. Until more texts are discovered, the story it wishes to tell will remain hidden. Archaeological investigations on Lemnos continue to uncover intriguing hints of thousands of years of habitation. Fortifications hidden beneath ash and earth layers, uncharted caverns, and hillside ruins obscured by brush could eventually be discovered by deeper digs, revealing a city, temple, or something else entirely. Or could there be more hidden beneath the fields and stones? An archive lost to time. Perhaps the Lemnian culture did not disappear with conquest or collapse, but rather was absorbed, its words forgotten, its structures repurposed, its stories diluted into Greek myth, or perhaps, like so many peripheral civilizations, it quietly withdrew into memory, leaving only fragments behind. As a result, we are left with a name, a stone, and the wind that moves across the Ion. Lemnos was once a crossroads of forgotten worlds, a final whisper from a people who stood between empires. Whatever the truth, the island waits peacefully, unassuming and still maintaining its silence. And in that silence, the Lemnians may still speak, if only we learn to listen. As the waters of southern Patagonia recede behind us, quiet, mist-bound and heavy with secrets, we turn now toward the cradle of ancient civilization, to a land where rivers are sacred, where reeds whisper beneath desert winds, and where history runs as deep as the Tigris and Euphrates, in southern Iraq and western Iran, along the marshes and canals of Mesopotamia. A quiet and enigmatic people have survived for centuries in the shadows of fallen empires. They are known as the Mandeans, guardians of an ancient spiritual tradition, and perhaps the last living trace of something far older than we yet understand. But there are whispers of more, of lost Mandean tribes, fragments of a once larger civilization that, like water through sand, slipped away from the record. Where did they go? Why did they disappear? And might some of them still be out there to walk through the marshlands of southern Iraq, especially before the ecological devastation of the late 20th century was to enter a world untouched by time, floating reed islands, intricate canal systems, and isolated homesteads created a kind of labyrinth where knowledge could be preserved in silence. It is here that the Mandans have long lived, a Gnostic people who revere John the Baptist, reject violence, and practice complex rituals of purification, always centered around living water. Their sacred texts, such as the Ginza Rabba, speak of light and darkness, of soul and body, and of spiritual descent into the material world. They do not prioritize, they keep their rites close, and they write in Mandic, a dialect of Eastern Aramaic that may echo back to the earliest centuries of our common era, or further still. But the Mandansas themselves speak of something more. According to certain traditions, they once numbered many tribes, not just scattered families, but full-fledged groups that lived across the ancient Near East, from the marshes of Iraq to the deserts of Jordan, and perhaps even into Arabia. Some texts refer to these tribes obliquely, others more directly, but always with a sense of loss. They were exiled, scattered, or disappeared entirely. Who were these missing Mandans? Could they have been wiped out during the upheavals of the early Islamic conquests? Or the wars between Persia and Rome, were they absorbed into other cultures? Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, until their identity dissolved, or did some of them go underground? Certain apocryphal traditions suggest that groups of Mandeans fled deep into the Arabian Peninsula or eastward into the Soos Mountains, preserving their beliefs in secret. Others were said to have taken refuge among the oases of the Syrian desert, and in a few rare instances, travelers from the 18th and 19th centuries. British officers, French missionaries recorded strange encounters, isolated communities that practiced baptism rituals, unlike those of Christians or Muslims who refused to speak of their origins. Were these remnants of lost Mandan tribes? Linguistically and theologically, the Mandans are anomalous. Their scriptures contain cosmologies that mirror early Gnostic texts found at Ng Hammadi. Texts once believed lost to history until rediscovered in Egypt in the mid-20th century, and yet the Mandean had preserved them all along in living tradition for nearly 2,000 years. Could the same be true for the tribes that vanished? Could there still be undiscovered pockets of people preserving versions of this ancient knowledge somewhere beyond the reach of the modern world? Some fringe researchers have drawn connections between the Mandeans and the Essens of Cuman, suggesting both were part of a broader Gnostic movement that predates mainstream Judaism and Christianity. Others go further still, proposing links to the Sabians of Haran, to Babylonian priestly cults, and even to Egyptian Hermeticism. These ideas remain speculative, but they raise a larger question. Was there once a widespread, loosely connected spiritual civilization across the Near East, one that has all but disappeared, save for the Mandeans? If so, where are its final echoes? The less tangible layers of Mandan history have not been extensively explored by modern archaeology. With so few monumental structures and most settlements centered around waterways rather than stone, it is difficult to trace the physical evidence of their past. Their oral tradition and parchment-preserved texts are also susceptible to decay, and the living core of their knowledge is becoming increasingly endangered due to recent waves of persecution, migration, and cultural pressure. Nevertheless, something endures. We are left to wonder whether lost Mandean tribes survived in the deserts of Arabia, in the Iranian mountains, as a forgotten sibling to the spiritual systems that later dominated the region, or perhaps a hidden community so small and isolated still be practicing its rites in silence, as it has for centuries in the dust and reeds of Mesopotamia. Truth is rarely loud, it whispers, and if you listen closely, you may still hear it. Mandean rituals seem to have remained exquisitely precise, unchanged for centuries, and their symbols, cosmology, and priesthood all seem to fit in with any known branch of Abrahamic religion. The Mandans are still there, but where are the others? A chant in a language that has been forgotten, a baptism in the light of the stars, a memory that will not die. The Atlantic into ancient Europe's haze, our journey now takes us to the dense forests and broad plains that stretch from the Carpathians to the Black Sea, a land of rivers that flow like veins through the soil of time, a land once haunted by a people whose name has nearly faded, but whose traces remain scattered like bones beneath. The hills they were, the Agatha, a civilization spoken of in riddles by ancient historians and largely forgotten by the modern world, the earliest mention of the Agatha comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC. He described them as a richly adorned, tattooed people living in what is now Romania and western Ukraine. They were said to wear gold jewelry and great abundance, and to practice a strange form of communal marriage. They shared wives, he wrote, so that all men might regard one another as brothers. They painted their bodies, wore elaborate garments, and perhaps most intriguingly held their kings and laws sacred above all else. But who were they really? Even in the ancient world, the Agatha were an enigma, however. The Agatha stood out because their customs, appearance, rituals, and beliefs seemed to form a civilization that was not quite like any other, archaeologically challenging to follow. Herodotus suggested that they were related to the Scions, the nomadic horse riders of the Eurasian steppe. Others suggested connections to the Thryon or Dion peoples, known for their warrior culture and rich spiritual traditions. Mounds of burial. The landscapes that were formerly connected to Agathi territory are dotted with cairns, many of which are loaded with objects that exhibit Scythian craftsmanship. Bronze weapons, although gold decorations and horse harnesses are common in steppe cultures. There are instances where the tombs appear to have distinct bodies dressed with jewelry, suggesting a fixed lifestyle rather than complete nomadism. There is indication of elite-level rulers in some tombs, possibly priests interred with ritual items whose function is still unclear. Were these the Agatha's graves, or just those of their neighbors? Linguistically, the mystery is further complicated by the fact that the Agatha left no written language of their own, at least. none that has been found. What little we do know comes from the perspectives of outside observers, yet certain hints have persisted. Since their homeland was a point of convergence where the Danube bends, where the steppe meets the forest, where east and west touched. Some scholars hypothesize that the name Agatha itself may have a Thryon or Indo-Iranian root, implying a blend of traditions. What happened to them by the time of Roman expansion into Dacia? The Agatha are no longer mentioned. They disappear from the written record. However, there are rumors of ancient kings who ruled before Dacia kings, who wore tattoos like armor, and spoke the language of stars and forests in some villages near the Carpathians. Some people think their name was lost as empires changed and borders changed, while others think waves of conquest from Scions, Celts, and Rome itself wiped them out. Perhaps they simply faded into silence and myth in Romanian folklore. Archaeological excavations have revealed pieces of unidentified provenance, including carvings of people wearing robes and carrying symbols that don't fit any known alphabet. Additionally, researchers have discovered odd patterns in local DNA samples that point to the continued existence of a unique population, long after their names had been forgotten by written history. Golden artifacts from tombs spanning from the Tisza River to the Transian Plateau were discovered. Some of these artifacts featured iconography not found in Scion or Thryon art, such as faces with glowing eyes, sunburst symbols using Dean Sear's writings, the enigmatic sanctuary of Sarmagatusa, and ancient references to sacred laws upheld. With religious fervor, some fringe theorists have even suggested that the Agatha were not just a people but the custodians of forgotten knowledge and an initiatic priestly caste lost in the folds of time. Could the Agatha have been more than just a tribe? Could they have been a Socratipine class, preservers of cosmology, astronomy, and rites that predated the rise of empire? In a world where winners frequently write history, these theories are intriguing despite being speculative. We are left with a name, a few artifacts, and the question of whether the Agatha disappeared into history, or if they deliberately slipped into the places where memory fades but never quite dies. The forests of the Carpathians still whisper, and perhaps somewhere within them the Agatha still watch, waiting to be remembered. But the quiet civilizations, those who did not build empires but sustained balance, tend to disappear. The Agatha may have been such a people, and their story lies not in the silence between the hills and the curve of gold, unearthed from a forgotten tomb in the pattern of tattoos, described by a man who met them 2,500 years ago. Through the pines and forgotten footpaths, we turn south, far south, to the arid highlands and sunlit plateaus of the Horn of Africa. Here, among the rugged mountains and ancient stone terraces of modern-day Eritrea and northern Ethiopia, lies the barely remembered echo of a kingdom that predates Aksum and the rise of Christianity in the region, a civilization shrouded in ambiguity, whose name is rarely spoken and whose disappearance still stirs questions among archaeologists and historians. Alike, this is the mystery of the kingdom of Damot, scattered across the Tyra highlands. Are enigmatic stone ruins cut with precision, aligned with care. Fortress-like structures, irrigation systems, and stepped terraces lie weathered beneath centuries of wind and sun. Inscriptions in an ancient script called South Arabian Musnad are etched into stone slabs, suggesting a literacy in connection to the Arabian Peninsula. And yet these are not Arab lands, these are African highlands, rich in history and still not fully understood. The remains of a towering temple that was built of finely fitted ashlar blocks without mortar are thought to have stood at Yeha, the capital of the Dmad kingdom, which by most accounts began to emerge around the 10th century BC and flourished until roughly the 5th century BC. Many scholars consider this to be one of the earliest known complex societies in the Horn of Africa, predating the renowned kingdom of Aksum by several centuries. Its symmetry and durability are reminiscent of techniques used in ancient Yemen, but this is where the mystery begins. Though the degree of this influence and the characteristics of the Demted kingdom itself are still up for question, it is certain that the Temple of Yeha is influenced by Sabian architecture, namely the style of the Kingdom of Saba across the Red Sea and what is now Yemen. The answers are unclear. Was Demt a South Arabian trading colony, a local civilization that appropriated architectural styles from its trading partners, or something else entirely, a native African monarchy that silently emerged with its own identity before history gave it a name? We know about Demt from fragments of inscriptions, pottery, and the foundations of temples and fortresses scattered across the highlands. While the architectural record speaks of sophistication, the historical record is deafeningly silent, and then abruptly as it seems dumped, vanishes by the 5th century BC. No royal tombs have been definitively identified, and no annals or administrative records have survived. The archaeological signal wanes later, in the 1st century AD, when the kingdom of Aksum emerges next to an empire that would later mint its own coins, create a written script, and grow into one of the greatest powers of antiquity. However, in Aksum's own records, Damut is not mentioned, honored, or mentioned. No continuity was recognized. What transpired over the intervening centuries was Damut, a direct forerunner of Aksum, with its structures repurposed, its elites folded into a rising power, or was it wiped out, culturally erased, and its name erased from memory? Some speculate that environmental changes may have contributed to the unsustainable nature of some agricultural systems, while others point to political fragmentation. Perhaps Demt was never a single kingdom, but rather a confederation of local rulers that were dissolved by conflict or absorbed into rival tribal systems. Still others suggested that there might have been a religious transformation, with temples losing their symbols and ancient dynasties being replaced by a new spiritual vision, and finally, more speculative theories. The Horn of Africa is still one of the least studied areas in terms of ancient archaeology, according to some researchers. Political unrest, numerous ancient sites remain unexcavated due to isolated terrain and restricted access. Nevertheless, satellite imaging has identified possible towns. Centuries of sediment and stillness could conceal roads and walls beneath the landscape locations that could provide hints about Demut's actual size and intent. The remains of a royal city, a library, and a tomb that may one day reveal the names of the long-forgotten monarchs. Others have proposed that the civilization never really vanished, but rather changed and was preserved in local oral traditions that are still present in some highland populations, ritual language, and ancestry. What about the Temple of Yeha itself? Despite its age, it remains a structure without mortar, unaffected by time, weather, or war. Within its stones, there is a precision and a silence that defies simple explanation. Ancient stories describe an era of stone builders and priest kings who knew the secrets of water and sky. Are these echoes of Damt refracted through centuries of retelling? The air still carries a sense of presence, not absence nor loss. But something waiting. Was Demted an empire without memory, a civilization erased, or simply a kingdom still out there, its story buried in stone, its name not lost but whispered? When no one has yet listened in the silence of the highlands, The past has not vanished, it waits. Was this really just a temple, or was it part of a larger, sacred complex now lost, whose function and meaning remain hidden? We may never know, but know. We now turn east, far east, into the mist-covered mountains of southern China, where clouds coil through ancient valleys and steep cliffs rise above thundering rivers, their silent sentinels still protecting the mystery of the Reem. These are not modern burials. Rather, they are the remains of a lost people known as the Bo. Little is known about this enigmatic ethnic group that once inhabited parts of modern-day America. Something unexpected clings to the stone coffins suspended from vertical rock faces, dozens of feet above the ground. Wooden boxes, weathered by centuries, perched in silence on beams driven deep into the cliffside. Some are balanced on natural ledges, others rest within shallow caves carved into the limestone. Provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, official records of the Bao people have long since vanished. The majority of their culture is preserved in fragments, scattered artifacts, oral traditions, and the eerie presence of their skyward tombs. But their story will never be forgotten. Who were the Bo? The name Bo first appears in Chinese texts as early as the Zhou dynasty records, which date back more than 25,500 years, and describe them as either skilled artisans or fierce warriors. Chinese imperial chronicles frequently described the Bo as one of many barbarian tribes that resisted assimilation. But what set them apart was their death ritual, which still baffles researchers today. Rather than burying their dead in the ground or burying them in towers or mounds, they raised their coffins hundreds of feet high above the earth, bearing the marks of their funeral customs. These hanging coffins appear along river gorges, particularly in areas close to the Yangtze. Some of these coffins date back more than 1,000 years, while others are even older. Why they placed their dead there? Was it to bring the spirits closer to the heavens, to protect the bodies from animals or desecration, or to mark the presence of the ancestors on the land itself as guardians over the living? No one knows for sure, and even more perplexing is how they did it. Many of the hanging coffins are perched above inaccessible rock walls that are difficult for contemporary climbers to reach. The cliffs provide no ledges, no paths, and no foothold. A level of expertise and purpose that much surpasses what was previously thought of these mountain people is demonstrated by the engineering and daring needed to elevate a coffin into such positions, many of which weigh hundreds of pounds. However, the Bo disappeared sometime during the 15th century. Legends from the area describe armies destroying their strongholds and murders. According to legend, the Bo resisted the Ming dynasty's expansion and were finally exterminated during a bloody campaign that destroyed entire villages, extinguished entire lineages, and erased their names, languages, and customs from living memory. The coffins remained high above the ground as the only reminder that a people had vanished. But are they really gone? Some hill tribes maintain burial rites that echo Bo customs, such as placing coffins into cave mouths or raising them onto wooden stilts. In remote villages close to the borders of Guizhou and Sichuan, old families talk of ancient ancestors who lived in the cliffs. Some fabrics and carvings include ornamental motifs that mimic designs on extant Bo artifacts. Could spirals, bird shapes, and sunbursts be examples of cultural relics, showing that not all Baos were destroyed, but that some survived and were assimilated into nearby tribes, diluting but not erasing their identity? Although the Bo language is officially considered extinct, some researchers have discovered odd phonetic patterns in regional dialects, such as unusual tonal shifts, words that have no obvious connection to Mandarin or other recognized ethnic languages. These could be subtle remnants of Bo speech preserved in lullabibas, or farming chants that have been passed down without knowing their origin. And there are also unverified reports. Several Chinese ethnographies in the 20th century reported hearing about isolated villages that were inaccessible by road, where ancient burial platforms stood atop cliffs that were untouched and unexplained. One report, which was never verified, described a small community whose elders claimed descent from those who walk above the valley. No documentation was followed. The trail went cold, but the cliffs remained, with dozens of hanging coffins still in place and others broken and fallen, still watching over the river valleys, which are not tourist destinations. Many are nearly impossible to access in some regions. Locals refuse to disturb them, considering the dead sacred or perhaps dangerous. What knowledge was buried with the Bo? Were they philosophers with a unique vision of life and death that required their spirits to hover between heaven and earth? Were they astronomers aligning their burial sites with celestial patterns we have yet to decipher? Or were they simply a people who carved a unique identity in stone and wood, only to be struck from the story of history? In a country rich with written tradition, the Bo left no texts, no known script, no carved laws or myths. To guide us, only the coffins, stark, solemn, and strangely beautiful, remain as their voice. What if something of the Bo still survives, not just in cultural memory, but in uncounted corners, in forgotten rituals, or in unmarked caves deeper than we've dared to look? What else might be hidden in the shadows of the cliffs? As the mist gathers once more around the regolins of southern China, one cannot help but wonder, are the Bo truly gone, or are they simply waiting to be seen again from above? And as the Bo coffins sway silently above, amidst the snow-capped ridges and dense jungle valleys, a people known as the Elder Brothers live. To the outside world, they are a remote indigenous tribe. But to some scholars and those who have lived among them, the Kogi are something far more profound, the living descendants of an ancient civilization that never truly vanished. High above Colombia's Caribbean coast, where the clouds hang low over sharp forested peaks, rises a mountain range unlike any other in the world, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Rising over 18,000 feet, is the highest coastal mountain on Earth and possibly the most mysterious. The scenery appears magical from above, with the mountains forming a nearly perfect pyramid and a sacred geometry concealed in plain view. The Kogi are still descendants of the Taruna, a pre-Columbian civilization that flourished for over 1,000 years. When the invaders arrived, the Taruna cities were burned or abandoned, their roads overtaken by jungle, but the Kogi did not disappear. They retreated into the heights, vanishing from maps but not from memory. They claim they never left. In a world where most ancient cultures have been reduced to ruins and relics, the Kogi offer something radically different: continuity. Their language is intact, their temples are still in use, their priests are still in operation, and time seems suspended with stone terraces cling to the mountainside remnants of forgotten cities that once pulsed with life. According to Kogi cosmology, the world was created by an all-knowing Mother Spirit who resides in the heart of the Sierra Nevada. To them, this is not just home. It is the center of the world, from which they say all life flows. They see themselves as caretakers of balance, keeping watch over the earth, not with machines or maps, but with attunement, vision, and sacred knowledge passed down in silence. Mamos, who were trained in darkness from birth, still lead their people with the same rituals, cosmology, and purpose as they have for centuries. It's amazing how much of this resembles archaeological truth. Prior to their retreat, the Taruna constructed one of the most advanced stone city networks in the Americas, complete with terraces, plazas, and stairways braided into the jungle Ciudad slopes. Purda, the lost city discovered in the 1970s by treasure hunters, is only the most famous of these, but to the Kogi, it was never lost. They've always known it as Tuna, a sacred place where the Mamo still make offerings to the earth. How many more such cities remain hidden beneath the forest canopy? Satellite scans of the Sierra Nevada have revealed geometric formations deep in the jungle, perfect circles, linear clearings, signs of human modification where no current settlements exist. Could these be the last traces of other Tirona communities, swallowed by time, yet somehow preserved beneath the green veil? And the deeper question remains, if the Kogi hold living memory of these places, what else might they remember in rare interviews granted only after months of negotiation? The Mamos have spoken of sacred books not made of paper but of stones and stars of knowledge that does not erode. They describe cycles of destruction and renewal of past civilizations that once reached great heights but fell when they stopped listening to the mother, to them blindly detached. Our civilization is only one more cycle in a vast chain that is headed for collapse. Their accuracy, not their mystique, is what makes their warning so eerie. Long before such ideas were generally acknowledged, the Kogi broke centuries of silence in 1990 to send a message to the outside world about climate change, deforestation, and the death of rivers. They claimed that the earth was out of balance, and that the destruction of holy places and waters would bring about ruin. Where does the ancient end and the modern begin? Is the Kogi culture an uninterrupted line to the Tirona, or is it something older that is an echo of an even more ancient Andean Atlantic network? Scientists at the time rejected the assertions as poetic, but 30 years later, every prediction has come true. Even by today's standards, their gold work, astronomy, and ecological knowledge appear sophisticated, and their cities, constructed without the use of wheels or iron tools, demonstrate an engineering prowess that is still unknown. Could they contain secrets from prehistoric times? Could their oral traditions preserve knowledge of disasters long forgotten during the migration era, floods or celestial events that are not inscribed in stone but rather in memory? Or perhaps the true mystery is not what lies beneath the jungle floor, but what lives on above it in the hearts and minds of a people who never stopped listening. The Kogi do not seek to be discovered, attention, or validation, and yet they continue to exist as living evidence of a civilization that may still exist, not as ruins, but as rhythm and worldview, as guardians of a mountain pyramid older than any monument we have constructed. As we observe their way of life, we are left wondering what else quietly survives in the high places of the earth, and what we might still learn from those who never abandoned the path. It's possible that certain civilizations still exist and are just concealed in plain sight in the far northern Pacific, where snow-laden winds blow. Pacific Ocean stretches vast and windswept lie the Chatham Islands, a small remote archipelago cloaked in mist, sea fog, and isolation. Here on these lonely islands, carved by wind and sea, lived a people almost forgotten by time. The Maori, the land itself feels untouched, ancient. The beaches are quiet, lined with driftwood that has traveled unimaginable distances inland. The rolling hills are blanketed in dense ferns and low wind-sculpted trees. There are no towering mountains, no large rivers, only the haunting vastness of sky and sea. It is a landscape that whispers rather than speaks, and within that whisper lives a mystery for centuries. The Maori lived in near complete isolation, separated from the Maui of mainland New Zealand by over 500 meters of open ocean. They developed a culture both unique and hauntingly peaceful. Oral tradition tells us they arrived from Polynesia, likely from New Zealand's South Island, sometime between 1200 and 1500 AD. But something changed when they reached the Chathams. They chose peace in a world where many early societies were shaped by conquest. The Maori embraced Nunuku's law, a strict code of non-violence, named after a revered ancestor who, according to legend, forbade warfare after witnessing cycles of bloodshed. From that moment forward, the Moriori would never again raise arms against one another. Conflicts were resolved by consensus, exile, or ritual, not violence, and so a civilization of extraordinary restraint and harmony emerged quietly, thriving at the edge of the world. But how long can peace exist in isolation? In 1835, this fragile world was shattered to groups of Maori warriors from mainland New Zealand. Inati Mutanga and Ngati Tama arrived on a hijacked European ship, bringing with them muskets as slavery and a worldview shaped by very different values. The Moriori, in accordance with their law, did not fight back. Instead, they welcomed the newcomers, shared food, and attempted to coexist. Over the course of the following few years, hundreds of Maori were killed, and the survivors were forced into slavery. It was thought that the last truly peaceful civilization on Earth had disappeared, but that is also a myth. However, in the late 20th century, descendants of the Maori started to speak again. Words from the old language were passed down, preserved in the margins of colonial documents, and within families who had been told to forget. Today, the Maori people are no longer regarded as extinct. They are acknowledged as resurgent, still connected to the land their ancestors once walked. But the mystery remains, not only in their survival story, but also in the deeper unanswered questions. How did such a profoundly peaceful culture develop on its own? Was it a response to past trauma, or the emergence of a completely new worldview? Perhaps more intriguingly, what if some aspects of that culture, those values and ways of being in areas we haven't yet explored? Beyond the cities and repaired moray, the Chatham Islands are still lightly populated. There are valleys and coastlines where few people travel, which may contain Moriori sites and unexplored graveyards. In recent years, archaeologists have started to uncover evidence that points to a more complex and advanced Maori society than previously thought. These include sophisticated fishing systems, storage pits, signs of organized horticulture, and strange abstract and ancient petroglyphs etched into stone along the coast. What meanings do these symbols carry? Are they maps, star charts, or spiritual markers that no one yet knows? Additionally, the Moriori language, which is currently reviving, contains unique grammatical structures and words not found in other Polynesian tongues. Could this be the result of long separation, or does it hint at deeper pre-Polynesian roots? The isolation of the Chathams raises questions about whether the Maori are more than just a forgotten branch of Polynesian culture, or if they are the last obvious link to a much older seafaring tradition that predates the Maui and possibly even the rise of the great Polynesian expansion itself. If so, what might still be hidden beneath the soil in unexcavated hills or within the DNA of plants brought by the first settlers' seeds of a forgotten world? Some fringe linguists have proposed the possibility of contact with other seafaring peoples from the northern Pacific cultures, or even remnants of earlier now-lost migration waves across Oceania. These deserts, which are now barren and unforgiving, were once alive with movement, not with cities or monuments, but with the quiet rhythm of nomadic life as evidenced by the Shazu, who were mentioned in Egyptian texts as early as the 15th century BC as a loose confederation of semi-nomadic tribes. The Shazu roamed the borderlands of Canaan, Edom, and the southern Levant regions that straddle modern-day Jordan. The sandstone ridges of the Negev and Sinai appear to exhale hot winds that sweep across jagged hills, casting long shadows that stretch towards the distant horizons of time. Egypt and Israel in temple inscriptions at Karnak, the pharaohs documented military campaigns into the Shasu territories, which were difficult to conquer, where enemies were elusive and the terrain itself was a silent ally to those who knew it. Their name, which means those who move on foot, was a fitting description for a people who left few permanent traces but whose presence was deeply felt by the great powers of the day. Nevertheless, one name sticks out among the hieroglyphs. It is a designation that has sparked centuries of discussion and suggests something much deeper. The term Shasu of Yuf is found in an Egyptian papyrus from the 14th century BC, during the reign of Amenhotep III. It describes a group of Shasu living at a location, or possibly beneath, a deity named Yahweh. The inscription says, "The land of the Shasu of Yah." For both academics and theologians, this small mention has grown into a hugely consequential puzzle. Although the linguistic similarities between Yaku and Yahweh are striking, they are not conclusive. The Shazu of Yu may have simply been a local tribal group with a toponym unrelated to the Israelite god. Others contend that the connection is more than coincidence, pointing to the geographic overlap. Could Yaku be an early reference to Yahweh, the deity later worshipped by the Israelites? If so, what does this imply about the origins of Yahweh and about the mysterious people who first invoked his name? In addition, ancient Israelite culture, at least in its earliest form, shares characteristics with Shasu life, such as a pastoral existence, the lack of monumental architecture, and a deeply personal tribal relationship with a single powerful deity. Could the roots of monotheism lie in the oral traditions of desert tribes rather than in temples or scrolls? Could the Shasu have carried the seeds of a religious revolution across the wilderness that would later blossom into the foundations of Judaism? What happened to Islam and Christianity? Over time, the name itself faded from inscriptions, maybe being assimilated into other identities like the Midianites or even the early Hebrews. But some stories maintain that they never really vanished. In contrast to the Israelites, the Shazu left no writings, and unlike the Canaanites, they did not build any stone buildings. In some of these stories, the sacred name of God is whispered in forms eerily similar to Yahweh, uttered not in a liturgical ceremony but in quiet reverence beneath the stars. Bedouin oral history still describes ancient tribes that wandered the mountains east of the Jordan under the guidance of dreams and visions. There is something more. Contemporary ethnographies working in the area have periodically documented tidbits of folklore about a people who followed a divine presence in solitary and silence, rather than in temples, and who spoke to the wind. In recent years, archaeologists have discovered petroglyphs, abandoned burial sites, and remnants of ancient migration routes and mapped corridors where a nomadic culture might have survived unseen in remote parts of the Sinai and southern Jordan, whose caves and canyons have remained largely unexplored. Some fringe theorists contend that although the Shazu may be extinct, their spiritual legacy endures throughout history far more loudly than the fleeting trace of their physical existence. They also suggest that remnants of the Shazu may still exist in secret in remote communities, their beliefs shrouded in secrecy, their stories told only among family members. We do know that these territories were originally inhabited by a people who were led by an entity older than monarchs and who lived without palaces, priests, or monuments, but who might have possessed something else. There are questions that linger in the desert's silence. Perhaps somewhere in its vastness, the Shasu still walk unseen, but never completely gone just beyond the blue. Could the Shasu of YV represent the earliest memory of Yahweh's worship? Did they pass their faith along to another people whose story we know better, but whose origins remain clouded? Or could there be more hidden among the cliffs of Edom or the valleys of sea, waiting for us to rediscover a forgotten lineage that changed the course of spiritual history? A section of dense primordial rainforest covered in bamboo rattan and the eerie cries of invisible birds can be found in the southern Philippine hills of Mindanao. There is a lot of moisture in the air. The world was first exposed to what appeared to be a living time capsule in 1971 when the Tokay, dressed in simple orchid bark clothing and speaking a language that had never been heard of before, were discovered. According to reports, the Tassidae were a Stone Age tribe that had been untouched by modern civilization. They lived in caves, hunted with primitive tools, and had no word for war. Their discovery sent shockwaves through the world's media, anthropology, and public imagination. At first glance, it appeared that such a people could have remained hidden for thousands of years, cut off from the march of progress. No word for wheelgun or city Philippine officials, journalists, and anthropologists descended upon the site, eager to study a tribe that seemed to have stepped out of the Paleolithic era. The caves in which they lived was said to be cool and dry, perched high in limestone cliffs, overlooking a rainforest valley that acted as a natural barrier to intrusion. But the mystery of the Tassidae soon deepened. Almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Why had no neighboring tribal groups known of their existence? Why was their Stone Age technology so pure? Why did they lack any signs of metalwork, pottery, or long distance trade features present even among other so-called primitive societies? And perhaps more curiously, why did their discovery happen under the regime of Ferdinand Marcos at a time when the Philippine dictator was seeking international favor? By the 1980s, doubts began to take root. A Swiss journalist, Oswald Eaton, returned to the Tokay area in 1986 following the fall of Marcos. He reported a very different picture. The caves were empty. The so-called Stone Age tribe now lived in modern clothing, in wooden huts, and some spoke local languages fluently. The original interpreter later admitted he had been told to act during the original discovery. Whispers of hoax began to circulate. Had the Tacit been a political fabrication, an elaborate deception to draw attention, funding, or prestige? Or was the truth more complicated? The Tokay may not have been entirely Stone Age, according to some anthropologists, but they were still a distinct group of the nearby Manobo people who had been living in relative isolation. The caves and cultural differences were real, but their representation to the outside world may have been overly romanticized or even manipulated by those who stood to gain. However, the story doesn't end with the debunking, because the Tokay are still elusive today. Their language still recognized as a distinct tongue within the Philippine linguistic landscape continues to be studied. Their territory, difficult to reach and legally protected, is rarely visited by outsiders, and some researchers maintain that elements of their lifestyle did remain uniquely isolated, even if not entirely frozen in time. This raises the deeper question: what does it mean for a civilization to be lost or hidden? Must it be ancient, monumental, or completely untouched by modernity to count? Or is it enough that it developed in quiet obscurity, preserving ways of life unfamiliar to the rest of the world? Could there still be remote communities In Southeast Asia, tribes like the Tokay, who have slipped through the cracks of global awareness, nestled deep in jungle interiors, shielded by geography and time. Satellite imagery of the Philippine archipelago reveals a landscape still riddled with unmapped valleys, cave systems, and forest interiors where footpaths vanish beneath canopies. Regions so isolated they are accessible only by weeks of foot travel. Could it be that even now there are families, clans, entire micro-societies living beyond the reach of modern eyes? And beyond the Philippines, what about the Indonesian archipelago and the larger Pacific? Papua and Melanesia harbor thousands of islands, many still thinly surveyed. If the Tokay, however, briefly emerged from the shadows of obscurity, might others still remain there undisturbed? The Tokay remind us that history is not always as linear as we imagine. Sometimes it loops, stutters, or hides behind layers of assumption and narrative. Were they a hoax, a misunderstood offshoot, a manipulated discovery, or perhaps something more fragile and nuanced, a genuine echo of a simpler time briefly illuminated and then retreated once again into mystery? In the end, the story of the Tastay leaves us not with answers, but with the feeling that somewhere out there in the folds of the forest there may still be people who live by rhythms older than the world we know, people whose footsteps never touch concrete, whose nights are guided by firelight, and whose stories are told only among the trees. And so we are left to wonder what else waits quietly, patiently, just beyond the edge of our understanding as the southernmost, windswept tip of the Americas reaches toward Antarctica. The great Rift Valley shimmers with silent majesty at sunrise, its cliffs and escarpments holding the secrets of time beneath its open skies. In the shadow of Lake Eyasi's glinting waters, throughout the golden grasslands of northern Tanzania, whispering through acacia trees and stirring the dust of an ancient land, the land feels timeless and unchanged. And here, on this stretch of earth where early humans once took their first steps, live a people who may never have truly left that ancient rhythm. They are among the last full-time hunter-gatherers on earth, and may be the closest surviving reflection of how our ancestors lived tens of thousands of years ago. But who are they really, and how have they managed to remain so silent and isolated from the vast expanse of modern civilization? To walk alongside the Hadza is to step out of time. The Hadza are neither an empire nor a kingdom, but rather something more elusive, a living echo of humanity's forgotten origins. Linguists have long puzzled over the Hadza language, which has clicks and glottal stops, similar to the Khoisan languages of southern Africa, but is otherwise unrelated to any known tongue. It is an isolated linguistic island in a sea of change, and that is where the mystery deepens, because the Hadza are not just a small tribe resisting assimilation. They are an enigma of continuity. They have no written texts, no centralized leadership, no permanent dwellings, and they don't plant crops, herd animals, or store food for more than a few days. Each morning they rise with the sun and follow the scent of the hunt, tracking baboons through thorn thicket or plucking tubers from beneath dry soil. Their lives follow the rhythm of wind and rainfall, of fruiting trees and migrating game. Unlike their neighboring groups, the Hadza do not tell stories of conquest or migration. Instead, they believe they have always been here. According to their oral traditions, they emerged from the land itself, as if the volcanic soil and lakebed reeds had breathed them into being. Genetic studies suggest their lineage may stretch back tens of thousands of years, possibly as far as 50,000 years, making them one of the oldest continuous populations on Earth. A surprisingly high degree of continuity is supported by archaeological data. Anthropologists have long studied the Hadza for insights into early human cognition, diet, and cooperation. But there is something more difficult to quantify: a sense that they exist in the space between what was and what might still be. Unlike modern societies that advance by accumulating complexity, stone tools discovered in the Lake Ossi region match those used by the Hadza today, with some dating back as far as the Middle Stone Age. Could it be that the Hadza are not just preserving a lifestyle, but embodying an entire way of being that stretches back to the dawn of humanity? And what might they know that we have forgotten? The Hadza continue to be rooted in presence rather than primitivism, yet their existence is not without its quirks. Even stranger are stories told by local pastoralists about people who disappear into the trees, appearing barefoot and silent, moving through the brush like shadows, speaking an unknown language, and other traces of forest paths and stone circles found deeper in the Yeda Valley. Far from known Hadza campsites where these ancient Hadza settlements or remnants of a sister culture once shared the valley and vanished into legend. Could entire clans still live off the grid, unnoticed by censuses or satellites, their fires concealed beneath the branches of sacred fig trees? Are these exaggerations based on myth, or have some Hadza bands withdrawn so deeply into the wilderness that they remain uncounted, unknown, and untouched in a world so thoroughly mapped and digitized? Some speculate that the Hadza's unique resistance to agriculture and permanent settlement isn't just cultural, it's philosophical, that they've chosen a different path, one where ownership is meaningless, hierarchy is absent, and nature is not something to be conquered, but lived with. If that is true, then perhaps the Hadza are more than a tribe. They are a quiet rebellion against the trajectory of civilization itself, and yet even that idea might be too neat, because to frame the Hadza as relics is to misunderstand them. They are not fossils, they are living, changing, choosing some young. Hadza men now wear watches or travel to town others, return to the bush, shrugging off modernity like a skin that doesn't quite fit. Their flexibility, paradoxically, is what has allowed them to endure. Still, the future remains uncertain. Encroaching farmland, climate disruption, and political pressure weigh heavily on their shrinking lands, and as anthropologists, governments, and tourists take greater interest, the Hadza face a quiet erosion, less visible than conquest, but no less real. So we are left to ask, are we witnessing the last breath of an ancient civilization, or merely a surface glimpse of something deeper, more enduring, hidden, just out of reach? Could it be that in the heart of Tanzania, beneath the trees where humans first learned to stand and speak and dream, there walks a people who never stopped listening to the land? And if so, what might they still remember that the rest of us have forgotten? Our journey now takes us to the windswept shores of the Mediterranean, where turquoise waves break against ancient stone. The island of Sardinia is rugged, mountainous, and steeped in secrets. Its interior is wild and untamed, its coastlines are lined with silent megaliths, and woven into its soil is the fading legacy of a people long shrouded in mystery. They are known as the Shardana. To the trained eye, their presence lingers in carved stone towers known as Nurog, scattered throughout Sardinia like a constellation. In stone, some are solitary, others form clusters. These megalithic structures date back to at least the 2nd millennium BC, but no written record explains their builders. No official history mentions their names. And still, the towers stand. Inscriptions and reliefs show the Shardana as part of the feared Sea Peoples, a confederation of maritime raiders who descended upon the eastern Mediterranean in waves of destruction. According to Egyptian texts, they were both enemy and mercenary, fighting against Egypt and later fighting for it. However, where had they come from? Scholars have long debated the origin of the Their name alludes to Sardinia, and their weapons and clothing resemble Bronze Age artifacts unearthed on the island and their cultural traces. Despite mounting evidence, no single theory has come to a consensus. Could Sardinia have been their homeland all along, or could it have been just one outpost? One obvious remnant of a seafaring civilization that stretched far wider than we know. Neuro bronze figurines, fortified settlements, point to a society that was both militarized and organized. Other scholars contend that the Shardana originated in Sardinia and conducted attacks throughout the Mediterranean from their coastal castles, while others maintain that they were originally from Anatolia or the Levant, and were displaced by climate change or war before settling in Sardinia. The archaeological record is incredibly lacking. Bronze weapons, there are stylized helmets and ceremonial swords, but not many inscriptions. There has never been any recovery of the Shardana language. Images carved onto temple walls, thousands of miles distant, with no books, chronicles, or libraries. This begs the question, how could such a powerful people who could cross oceans and challenge empires leave behind so little? Some people think the answer is in their nature, although other theories go deeper. The Shardana may have been a more mobile nation of elite seafarers, and possibly even pirates, whose power lay in mobility rather than permanence. Their settlements may have been seasonal or decentralized. Their knowledge may have been oral rather than written, and their loyalty may have changed with the tides of opportunity and conflict. The Shardana were a part of a lost Mediterranean civilization that existed before the classical powers and whose memory survives in fragmentary form, according to some fringe scholars. Sardinia's neurogenic towers and the Balearic Islands, Taliats. Could the Shardana have been a part of a larger cultural network that crossed borders, traded in silence, and disappeared before history's scribes could capture them? The Cyclopean walls of Messini, the forgotten port cities of the Levant local legends in Sardinia, also contain intriguing hints about an ancient race of giants that constructed the Neurage. Some locals believe their ancestors came from the sea, and rites are still performed today that appear to be a reenactment of earlier ceremonies and processions that resemble military formation. Dances conducted in front of lost meaning stone monuments. Geologists have also observed that although the Shardana are never specifically mentioned, their presence seems to linger in some way. They have discovered that parts of the island are still unexplored, with dense forests, remote mountain valleys, and underwater coastal shelves that may still contain unexcavated ruins that could hold the secret to the Shardana's origins. Perhaps even their language or burial customs are hidden beneath the surface, hidden by sediment and time. What became of them? Did they leave behind only stone towers and forgotten names when the Bronze Age ended, like so many others, or were they assimilated into the expanding Iron Age empires of the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, or Phoenicians? In the quiet of Sardinia's mountains, where Nero continues to cast shadows at nightfall, the mystery lingers, and it's simple to picture the sound of bronze hitting stone. Whether they were the Shardana warriors, builders, wanderers, or something else entirely, the glint of a horned helmet on the horizon, the rhythmic beat of oars cutting across dark water. Or perhaps they are simply hidden and waiting for us to read the sea, the stone, and the silence more carefully. Honduran jungles and the myths surrounding La Ciudad Blanca here in the vast wooded reaches of what is now Quebec. The landscape changes once more, becoming colder, sharper, and equally mysterious. The kingdom of Sagwan, a land of wealth, beauty, and secrets that may never have been intended for outsiders to know, is located in Canada. It is a region that is rugged, defined by icy rivers, glacial valleys, and dense boreal forest that stretches for hundreds of miles in all directions. The land feels ancient, untouched by time, still ruled by the rhythms of wind and water. And somewhere in this wild, primordial landscape, so the stories go, Canada is a mystery that has been virtually completely forgotten by modern history. The story starts in 1535 when French explorer Jacques Cartier, traveling under the auspices of King Francis II, came across the Iroquoian people at which is close to modern-day Quebec City. There, he met their chief Donnacona, who told him about a place far to the north called Saguin. Unlike the simple wooden settlements Cartier had seen, Saguin was described as something entirely different. A kingdom of immense riches, where people wore silk, gold necklaces, and houses were made of shining stone instead of bark. To European ears, the description echoed the dreams of El Dorado or Or, those far-off shimmering realms where kings walked barefoot on gold. Intrigued, Cartier pressed for more Donnacona, who insisted the place was real, saying he had spoken with men who had seen it. The chief died in Europe, far from the land he knew, and the secret of Saguin died with him. Cartier documented these conversations in his journals, which have survived to this day, but Saguin was never located. Instead, he would return to France with Donnacona in tow, possibly as evidence or as leverage. The name Saguenay is still etched into the geography of Quebec's rivers, towns, and fjords that carry the word like an echo. And the region itself is still remote and little explored until recent decades. Cartier launched subsequent expeditions to search for the fabled kingdom, but each one ended in disappointment due to harsh weather, disease, and misunderstandings. Eventually, the French crown abandoned the quest, dismissing Saguin as a myth or misunderstanding, but the idea persisted for centuries. Could the stories Donnacona told have been based on true observations of a rich northern land, or could they have been something more? Some historians speculate that Saguenay might have referred to a real indigenous society that was unknown to Europeans at the time. Perhaps a trading confederacy that stretched beyond the St. Lawrence Valley into the interior of Canada. Geological surveys have revealed significant mineral wealth in the surrounding area, including iron, copper, and even traces of gold. There are also the stranger theories, which suggest that the Iroquois may have described a network of settlements linked by trade, ritual, and myth rather than a single city. But no direct archaeological evidence has ever been linked to such a civilization. According to some fringe researchers, Saguin was not a kingdom of this era at all, but rather a memory of an earlier time, a remnant of a pre-Columbian, even pre-glacial civilization that was passed down orally and mistakenly interpreted as contemporary. The stories Cartier heard may have been echoes of a people who vanished and left behind no ruins or inscriptions. But there may have been something deeper, a memory etched in myth. There are even claims, though they are hard to confirm, that early settlers and 19th century fur traders, Jesuit missionaries, and indigenous elders heard variations of the same legend from indigenous elders of a white city to the north, a place where people vanished into the mountains and returned altered or not at all. Whispers of structures hidden in valleys engulfed by time and the earth. Skeptics contend that Saguenay was a fabrication that was told to Cartier in order to divert, entertain, or entice him away from tribal lands. If this is the case, why was there such a focus on wealth, silk, gold, and stone. And why did the idea keep coming up? Even after the initial wave of exploration was over, the area surrounding the Saguni River is still a place of pristine beauty and quiet secrecy. Tall cliffs drop into frigid seas. Pines sway over abandoned paths, and deeper still, beneath layers of ice, soil, and unspoken memory, might something be waiting. Perhaps not a city of gold, but the remnants of a culture lost before its name could be written. Or could the kingdom of Sagwan have never been a place at all, but rather a message meant only for those who would listen? As with so many ancient tales, the answers lie somewhere between geography and imagination, and the forest seems to be speaking as we travel further along the shadowed edges of forgotten history, and now cross the Atlantic to the rocky of Linus sink back into the sea. We move on towards a place where myth and landscape are so intertwined that it is nearly impossible to separate them. We reach the western edge of Europe, which is windswept, rain-soaked, and incredibly old. This is Ireland, a land of rolling green hills, rocky coastlines, and stones that predate time itself. Deep within the legends of this place lies a civilization unlike any other, a people known for their terror as well as their mystery. They are known as the According to the Labour Gabala. The Meroans are mentioned in the oldest Irish writings, before even the renowned Tuatha De Danann, Aaron. The Book of Invasions describes how the Femerans were among the first people to settle. In Ireland, they were rulers, tyrants, and occasionally even gods, and they vanished one day. But were they ever truly there in the first place? According to legend, the Femerons lived in the sea or on isolated islands far from the western horizon. Some accounts place their strongholds beneath the waves, while others were hidden in mountain fortresses. They were more than just another tribe. They were a force of nature that was both feared and revered. Their leader, Bela of the Evil Eye, could kill with a single glance, but even as they fought war and shaped the early world of Celtic myth, it was never clear where they came from. Were they invaders from another land, or were they the land's first guardians, transformed into something darker by time and memory, unlike many mythic peoples? Some scholars have proposed that the Pharaons are the humanoid embodiment of the raw, untamed forces of nature, chaos, storm, sea, and death. Others see them as a distorted memory of a real pre-Celtic people, possibly a once powerful seafaring culture in the British Isles, whose memory was preserved only through distorted echoes. In myth, then, there is the geography. The Pharaons are hard to define because they are not easily classified as spirits, mortals, or gods. Ireland is home to numerous megalithic structures, including Dolmen's Passage, tombs, and stone circles, whose functions are still unknown. Sites like New, Grange, and Carrowmore predate Egypt's pyramids, but we know very little about the people who built them. Could these enigmatic monuments be the remains of a once thriving civilization that was later demonized or mythologized as the Femerans? Or were the Femerans never intended to be remembered as fully human? Some stories describe them as one-eyed or having limbs of various sizes, or skins like bark or stone. They were said to have arrived in dark ships shrouded in mist, and some later interpretations connect them to pirates or Norse invaders. But the stories are much older than the Viking era, and a single theme runs through them all. The emerge from the water, disappear into it, and may even reappear in the present era. Even stranger theories suggest that the Femerans were not simply ancient humans or spirits, but something completely different. Archaeologists have found evidence of maritime cultures along the Atlantic coast of Europe that date back thousands of years, much earlier than previously thought. Could the Femerins be a cultural memory of sea-born people who arrived on Irish shores millennia before the Celts traded, raided, or settled briefly before disappearing? Others speculate about pre-Ice Age maritime societies, whose knowledge was lost with rising seas, leaving only faint traces in story and stone. But these theories are still unproven. Some fringe researchers suggest they were survivors of a lost Atlantic civilization, possibly connected to larger flood myths from around the world. The Femerins are mostly mythical, yet their depiction has persisted over generations. They are frequently associated with storm and sea, and there is an inexplicable silence surrounding their genesis that raises more questions than it does answers. Perhaps the Femerins were never just a people, but rather a symbol of what came before memory, record, and history. Or perhaps they're still out there beneath the waves, beyond the mist, waiting. And as the sea mists surrounding the Femerins drift back into legend, which we now understand, why did the Irish remember the Femerins so clearly, but never write down where they came from or where they went? Why do so many ancient cultures speak of sea-born peoples with great power and strange appearance? Rustling foliage, we now travel across the world to the misty highlands of South America, where the land once inhabited by the Moisa Confederation, the civilization remembered today more for its myth than for its reality, lies on the ridges and savannas of Colombia's eastern Andes. Beneath that myth, however, something still shimmers faintly, possibly not just gold, but something deeper that is still waiting to be discovered. The Moisa people once lived on the high plateau of Cundamaca and Boyaca, also known as the Altiplano. It is a land shaped by sharp cliffs, still lagoons, and a quiet that seems ancient. It is here that one of the most enduring legends of the Americas was born, the story of El Dorado. However, in the early 1500s, Spanish chroniclers began to report strange stories from the interior of the New World, not of gold-paved cities, as later legends would claim, but of a man who covered himself in gold dust and offered treasures to the sacred waters of Lake Guadvita. He would plunge beneath the surface of the lake as an offering to the gods, disappearing for a while before returning purified. This ritual was real, and Spanish explorers witnessed the remnants they recovered artifacts, ornaments with elaborate shapes and gold trinkets of ceremonial figures, one of the most iconic. The Moisa raft, now housed in Bogotá's Gold Museum, depicts the very ceremony in fine detail, a raft of cast gold carrying a central figure, surrounded by attendants, a memory. Cast in metal, but the Spanish, driven by greed and imagination, reinterpreted the ritual as a pointer to something larger and entire. City of gold hidden in the jungle, they searched, they drained parts of Lake Guadvita. They explored deep into the Amazon, convinced that the Moisa were merely the gatekeepers of a much greater empire to the east, and yet they never found it. Why the Moisa Confederation was not a single empire, but a complex network of communities, organized, advanced, and spiritually rich. They excelled in salt mining, agriculture, and metallurgy, producing some of the finest gold work in pre-Columbian South America, but their power was not defined by conquest. Instead, it came from balance with nature, with their gods, and with each other. Still, when the Spanish arrived, something strange happened. Unlike the Inca or the Aztec, whose capital cities could be located and seized, the Moisa seemed to dissolve their settlements. While sizable, were often temporary or decentralized there. Most sacred sites, this dispersal, according to some, was deliberate because the Moisa knew how to vanish, and that members of their confederation might have survived concealed away in the highlands, shielded by terrain and secrecy. Caves, lagoons, and mountain peaks were hard to reach, shrouded in fog, and protected by geography itself. Moisa language, customs, and rituals are still practiced in isolated Andean villages today. According to some researchers, the Spanish mistook spiritual opulence for material wealth, and the Moisa's greatest treasures weren't kept in palaces, but rather in sacred places encoded in ritual and landscape. There are also recurring rumors of unmapped structures deep in the highland forests. Some rituals echo the gold offerings once given to lakes like Gatava, Aguaca, and Tota. The descendants of the Muiza are still living quietly in the outskirts of modern Colombia, but the full extent of their ancient knowledge, their cosmology, and their buried treasures remain elusive, which begs the larger question: was El Dorado ever about wealth at all? Forms of stones that are out of place with contemporary communities. Early explorers' reports mention dry canals, terraces, and underground roads that could indicate the presence of old hydraulic systems. Others cite myths about sacred cities that are beyond the Confederation's known boundaries and are only accessible by the initiated. And of course, there are the lakes. Despite multiple attempts, Lake Guadvita's full depths have never been fully explored. Its circular shape, believed to have been formed by a meteorite impact, lends a cosmic touch to the story. Over the centuries, dredging teams and divers have recovered artifacts, but most people agree that much remains buried beneath sediment layers or hidden in underwater caverns. The Moisa may have left behind more than we realize, but no modern instruments have yet to survey it. Encoded symbols rather than gold or diamonds alignments and holy geography. May there be a location in the Colombian highlands where the El Dorado ritual was not only carried out but also protected. A city or sanctuary that was not lost but rather covered by the same mountains that created it. If you stand at the edge of Lake Guadvita at dawn, when the mist rises and the sky reflects off still waters, you might feel that the story is not yet over, and that the Moisa are not just a legend that has been left behind, but a civilization that may still be watching, hidden in the folds of cloud and stone as the fog. The winds here still whisper in the language of the ancients. Another surprise awaits you as you travel inland, deep into the sun-drenched center of the North American continent. Here, in the parched American Southwest and the broad plains that stretch towards Kansas, you will find golden cities glimmering on far-off vistas rather than ancient tombs or ocean storms. Quivira and Shambhala are cities that may have never existed or may have been for a very short time before disappearing completely. During Spain's relentless exploration of the New World in the 16th century, conquistadors thought there was more to be discovered in the vast empires of wealth that lay just beyond the known boundaries. In the arid, harsh regions of what is now New Mexico and the Great Plains, native tribes spoke of cities to the north, where streets gleamed in the sun and houses were constructed of precious metals. These 7 cities were collectively referred to as Shambhala. Particularly, one man developed an obsession with these stories. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led a great expedition north from Mexico in 1540 with the goal of discovering these golden realms. Along the way, he came across PBLO, real thriving communities, but none of them matched the size or splendor of what he was looking for. Nevertheless, the stories continued. So Coronado continued to push farther into the unknown until he was led east by a mysterious guide named El Turco, who told him about a kingdom even more magnificent than Shambhala, a place called Quivira, located far across the plains. Coronado endured starvation, hardship, and hundreds of miles of empty land before arriving in Quivira, what is now thought to be Kansas, where he discovered nothing but a small settlement of grass huts, simple people no treasure, and no empire. The names Kuvera and Sibylla have persisted in American culture for centuries, appearing on early maps, whispered in frontier legends, and woven into the mythos of a continent that has yet to be fully explored. Some historians contend that the entire story was a tragic misunderstanding, with indigenous peoples describing actual cities like the Pueblo of the Zuri or Hopi, which were later exaggerated into cities of gold by Spanish ambition. Others say that the deceit was intentional in order to send the conquistadors stumbling into the woods far from their homelands, but the riddle still eludes explanation. Archaeological digs and satellite surveys around the southwest continue to uncover the remains of long-gone settlements, some of which are well known, such as Mesa Verde or Choco Canyon. Others, yet hardly comprehended, enormous roads, irrigation systems, and ceremonial buildings, reveal an intricate web of ancient societies that were far more advanced and integrated than previously believed. Could the tales of Sibylla and Kuvera have been recollections of actual civilizations that were already in decline or change when the Spanish arrived? Or more provocatively, could they have been cities that were seasonal or made of materials that the earth had long since reclaimed? Cities that moved in time with the climate, war, or trade. A kingdom that arose in the high deserts or along river valleys, flourished for a while before dissolving and leaving only oral traditions. Gold artifacts, the distant echo of gold, and even the idea of gold itself, all worth considering. To the European mind, gold represented empire and power. But in many Native American communities, gold had little tangible value. Could it be that the treasure was never in wealth, but rather in wisdom, rituals, or hidden histories? And that the golden cities Coronado was told were spiritual centers or sacred sites shining in myth rather than metal? There are also contemporary reports of ranchers, hikers, and amateur explorers who say they have discovered odd ruins in isolated canyons or noticed shimmering objects just beneath the surface of dry lake beds. Although many of these claims have been rejected or are still unsubstantiated, they still evoke the feeling that something is still out there, just out of reach. And there are, of course, fringe theories. Others attribute the mystery to lost Atlantean outposts or Price Age, civilizations whose records were destroyed in a worldwide apocalypse, while others contend that Kuvera and Sibylla were not native at all, but rather the remains of Old World explorers who arrived long before Columbus. Phoenicians or Chinese fleets may have been blown off course. Although these theories are still very much outside the realm of recognized research, the lack of solutions keeps them alive. As the route of Kuvera and Sibylla eventually disappears, the names of the rivers, counties, and ghost towns remain, as though the earth itself recalls something we no longer comprehend. Were these cities ever real, or are they the embodiment of a deeper truth? The trail started in dust, wind, and open sky. In the shifting sands and whispering plains of the American interior, civilizations arose, flourished, and vanished before history could record them. The quiet is immense, but if you listen carefully, you may still hear the faint echoes of footsteps looking for gold, which was never just gold, with them, the last forgotten words of the Lemnian culture. We now journey far south, down the length of the Americas, beyond deserts, mountains, and forests, to a place where land fractures into countless islands and the sea becomes a maze of cold. Mist-shrouded channels here in the extreme southern reaches of Chilean Patagonia, among the fjord's ice-clad peaks and tangled archipelagos of the Chiloé and Ison regions. A different kind of civilization once moved quietly through the waters, a seafaring People, elusive, self-sufficient, and nearly invisible to time, they were known as the Chono. To most, their name is little more than a footnote in colonial records, mentioned briefly by Spanish explorers and missionaries as inhabitants of the fragmented islands south of Chiloé, and yet for centuries the Chono people thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth. They built no cities, left no stone temples or written histories. Their trails were etched only into waves, fog, and memory, but in the silence of the sea channels their legacy still whispers. The Chono were maritime nomads who were skilled navigators of the winding waterways that cut through the Patagonian fjords. They traveled in canoes called dulcas, which were made of coiled planks and were ideal for the choppy, unpredictable waters of the southern Pacific. They hunted sea lions, fished, collected shellfish, and moved seasonally from island to island. Their world was fluid, shifting like the tides, and by the late 18th century, the Chono were thought to be extinct by colonial authorities. Disease, displacement, forced assimilation, and missionary pressure all played a part in their disappearance. From historical records, some were absorbed into nearby groups like the Kovskar or Hilish, while others may have retreated even further into the coastal wilds. But no decisive moment marked their end, like the fog that so frequently envelops their homeland. The Chono simply disappeared, but did they really disappear? In recent decades, researchers and explorers have visited the islands where the Chono once lived, and they have discovered evidence that the story may not be over. Local fishermen and Patagonian families have spoken of isolated settlements, clusters of huts found deep in remote fjords that have been abandoned for a long time but have strangely recently been constructed. Some have reported coming across individuals or families in the 20th century who lived in near total isolation, speaking dialects that were not fully recognized, and who claimed no clear ancestry in the most densely populated areas of the archipelago, where no roads lead and boats sail for days without seeing another human. Could remnants of the Chono have survived, hidden in the folds of a landscape no empire ever truly conquered? There is also the question of identity. Instead of using parchment, the Chono kept their traditions through practicing memory and hand-to-hand navigation maps carved into experience. They left no written language behind. Spanish chroniclers only documented tidbits, frequently misrepresenting what we call the Chono may not have been a single people, but rather a varied collection of maritime clans, united by necessity and territory, yet distinct in language and thought. It's possible that some of those tribes have just decided to vanish. The Chono cosmology, or how they saw themselves in relation to the water sky and shifting coastlines, was never fully documented. Knowledge may have vanished, or perhaps it was never meant to be shared. These modest remains, which include mitten heaps of shells and bones, remnants of doula workshops, fire pits buried under moss and soil, speak of the continuity of a people who lived lightly on the land but deeply in rhythm with the sea. Their spiritual practices, which were hinted at through ritual hearths and burial locations, are also largely unknown. Some names and notes referring to native harbors, safe passages, and places of gathering are subtly removed by later cartographers as those areas became uninhabited. Did these marks represent actual Chono territories? And if so, why were they erased? Early Spanish charts of the area occasionally mark settlements or anchor points far deeper into the archipelagos than expected. According to some scholars, the Chono purposefully mislead colonial explorers, diverting them off holy locations and making their charts disappear into mazes of islands that were only known to them. Others contend that with more than 5,000 islands and innumerable undiscovered inlets, the geography itself offered cover, making it possible for some Chono lineages to have persisted into the present day with their names changed and their identities shielded by silence. Could the people we now refer to by different names have survived? Even today, the Patagonian fjords are among the most remote places on Earth. Satellite imagery frequently cannot reach the dense fogs and overhanging canopies, and boats and roads are the only means of transportation. Entire islands may go years without a visitor. So what exactly is left out? There a forgotten canoe resting in a tidal cove, a language that is still spoken and whispered around a fire that no one else will see, or perhaps an entire way of life, preserved in secret, protected by the canals, continue to be traversed by wind. The sea continues to speak in its ancient cadence, and the Chono may still be listening there, hoping that people would remember that not all civilizations vanish via collapse, some just decide to vanish. The Andaman Islands, a remote, ancient archipelago that is fiercely protected by law and nature, are home to more than just coral reefs and tangled mangrove swamps. Deep within the forests of the South and Middle Andaman, a people known as the Jet, who were given this name by outsiders, have lived on these islands for tens of thousands of years, untouched by the empires that rose and fell beyond the waves to the modern world. They are frequently referred to as isolated or primitive, but these labels completely miss the point. The Jara are not a relic of the past. They are a living people, alert, skilled, and conscious of the world that presses in around them, and yet they remain enigmatic. Where did they come from? How long have they lived here, and how have they resisted the pull of modernity for so long? Genetic studies have traced the roots of the Jarawa people back over 50 years, placing them among the first humans to leave Africa and settle along the coastal routes of southern Asia. They are part of the broader Negrito population, characterized by small stature, dark skin, and tightly curled hair, who once occupied vast areas across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Most of those populations have vanished or assimilated, but the Gira remain. They move silently through the forest, hunting wild pigs with bows crafted from jungle vines, gathering honey with the guidance of smoke and patience. They know the seasons not by a calendar, but by the flight patterns of birds and the rhythm of the sea for generations. They have evaded full contact with outsiders, repelling intrusions with a combination of cunning and force. Attempts to civilize or assimilate them have often ended in failure or tragedy, and yet questions persist. Who were the Jarawa before they were the Jarawa? Oral histories from the Andamanese peoples, who are divided and few in number, describe the movements of opposing tribes and splinter groups. Their origins were unknown, despite colonial stories from the 19th and early 20th century portraying them as strong protectors of their forest. Even now, some people think the Jarawa are descended directly from an old Andam civilization that may have existed for a long time before the country they formerly inhabited was engulfed by increasing sea levels. This civilization may have been larger, more extensive, and perhaps even highly sophisticated in its own right. Satellite imagery has hinted at possible submerged structures along the coasts of the Andamans. Linear ridges and formations inconsistent with natural erosion. Could these be remnants of lost settlements belonging to a time when the islands were larger and drier? Others point to unexplained similarities between the Jara and distant cultures across the Indian Ocean. Linguists have noted curious overlaps between certain Jar words and fragments of Austroasiatic languages. Could this suggest contact or even shared ancestry with seafaring peoples far beyond the horizon? Of course, mainstream archaeology remains cautious. Much of the speculation is hindered by the limited access granted to the Garawa territory, and rightly so, the tribe's autonomy is protected under Indian law. Direct contact is forbidden without special permission and for good. Recent diseases, as mild as the flu, have devastated uncontacted groups. In the past, and yet in this inaccessibility, lies part of the mystery, what knowledge is held within. Jarawa oral traditions, knowledge that outsiders have never heard. What memories do they carry of a world before? Modern maps before colonizers arrived. Before the islands themselves shrank beneath the rising sea. Some fringe theorists go further. They suggest that the Jarawa are the last remnants of a forgotten maritime culture, one that once stretched across the Indian Ocean, linking Madagascar, the Maldives, and even parts of Southeast Asia. They imagine hidden villages deep within the island interiors, where ancient songs are still sung in dialects. Unknown to the modern ear, they speak of carved stones, overgrown with moss and fire rituals, passed down unchanged for millennia. Others imagine that the Jara, in choosing isolation, have preserved not only their bloodline, but a way of life, a worldview, and a set of spiritual beliefs that predate recorded history. And here the line between mystery and reverence becomes thin, for to imagine that the Jara are lost or left behind is to misunderstand them entirely. They are not forgotten, they are hidden by choice. In a world racing forward, obsessed with progress, the Jarawa have held firm. Tethered not to technology, but to memory, to land, and to the quiet wisdom of survival. Could they be descendants of a civilization? We've never known one whose markers lie beneath the jungle canopy, or perhaps just beyond the edge of our understanding. Or is the true mystery not their origin, but their endurance? There are no simple answers. Only shadow stories and the footsteps of a people who have always lived just beyond the reach of history and just beyond the mist, shrouded in mystery. How can a people in an era of satellites and smartphones still remain invisible? And what if anything do they remember about a time before time in the silence of the Andaman forest? The disappearing footprints of the Mandean tribes are carried by the marshes of southern Mesopotamia as they fade into memory. Today, we travel over continents and oceans to reach the serene regions of northeastern Louisiana. This is Poverty Point, a location constructed thousands of years ago by someone we still don't fully understand. It was discovered in the 19th century, but has only been thoroughly studied in the last few decades. It is located on a wide terrace above the Mississippi River floodplain. At first glance, the site appears completely unassuming, with grassy ridges arcing in subtle patterns across the land, creating crescent shapes too symmetrical to be natural. Adjacent to this, a large earthen mound rises silently and steadily, observing the landscape. One of the most amazing and enigmatic archaeological sites in North America. Poverty Point spans almost 900 acres and is made up of a complex of concentric ridges, radiating aisles, and monumental mounds. It was built between 1700 and 00 BC, long before the Maya or the great cities of classical Greece rose to power. But the people who built it left no name, no language, and no clear identity. All we know is that they lived in poverty. The ridges formed a huge semicircular pattern of living rooms that probably accommodated thousands of people. Thus, the point was not only a place for people to congregate. A 70-foot-high earthwork shaped like a giant bird or talon required the movement of an estimated 15 million basket loads of soil done by hand, without beasts of burden, without metal tools, and it was built in an astonishingly short span, possibly as little as 90 days. The scale alone raises questions. This was not a village. This was a planned center, a ceremonial, political, or perhaps spiritual hub, but for whom archaeologists refer to the people behind it as part of the poverty point culture. Yet the term masks our uncertainty. They were hunter-gatherers. No evidence of large-scale agriculture has been found, and yet their organizational capacity rivals that of later farming societies. They imported materials from as far as 800 meters away, copper from the Great Lakes soapstone from the Appalachians, sea. From the Ozarks they crafted intricate tools, weights, beads and effigies, some of which appear to have had symbolic or religious significance. And then sometime around 1100 BC, the culture disappeared, the site was abandoned, the ridges slowly eroded, the great mound stood alone. Why there are no signs of conquest, no mass graves, no fire or flood layers? Some speculate that the site's collapse was caused by changing trade routes or natural changes, while others propose that changes in religion or cosmology, people moved on due to lost beliefs. But no clear solution has surfaced. The fact that no distinct, direct descendant culture has been found is even more intriguing. Some have questioned whether the builders of Poverty Point truly disappeared, or if traces of this society may have moved elsewhere, settling in new areas under different identities or blending into smaller tribal groups. They seem to have flourished and disappeared, leaving behind a monumental legacy without a name. These echoes of Poverty Point are found in oral histories of several Native American groups, which describe ancient ancestors who traveled from the east from a large earthwork metropolis constructed in rings. The chronological gap is still perplexing because Poverty Point predates all of them, and there is no obvious cultural continuity that connects them directly. In addition, some have hypothesized that the builders of Poverty Point were part of a larger Pananal tradition, an ancient civilization that connected mound-building cultures from the Mississippi Valley to the Gulf Coast and beyond. Later cultures like the Adena Hopewell and Mississippian peoples also built mounds, organized towns, and traded across great distances. The radiating isles may indicate solstice, sunrises, or moonrises, which some researchers believe indicate a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. If this is true, the builders would have had both engineering knowledge and a cosmological framework, complex enough to shape monumental architecture. But if that knowledge existed, where did it go in contrast to other ancient centers? Kanteoti, Cahokia, or maybe Anchor, perhaps. This is what makes Poverty Point so eerie. It doesn't seem to have been rediscovered, re-inhabited, or ritualized by later groups. It was just left. The silence suggests a people whose purpose and story may have been purposefully obscured by time, either by nature or by choice. Could they have chosen to leave no lasting trace of themselves beyond their architecture? Was their knowledge passed down in ways we cannot recognize, in symbols carved into stone that we no longer understand? Or could a part of them still remain in hidden mounds overgrown by forest in stories not yet heard by descendants, unaware of the legacy buried beneath their feet? Poverty Point challenges our preconceptions about the complexity of civilization, including who writes history and who vanishes into it. Its quiet presence lingers, leaving us with unanswered questions about who built it, where they went, and what else might be patiently waiting for us to listen. As we depart from Poverty Point's meticulous and silent earthwork spirals, we cross back over. Kissed seas encircle intricate fjords. The world appears to vanish under sea spray, frigid silence, and the shifting light of a grey sky. The area seems more forgotten than abandoned. It is a location outside of history where time seems to stand still, and the environment seems to be alive with ancient memory. The Yagin, also known as the Yamina, still talk about their people in this icy solitude. For thousands of years, The Yagan people lived in the southern Patagonian archipelago, especially the area between the Beagle Channel and Cape Horn. They survived in one of the planet's most hostile environments by navigating these icy straits in canoes, made of tree bark without the use of fireproof clothing, shelter, or even shoes. They wore the cold like a second skin. Early European explorers, including Charles Darwin, were baffled by the Yagan. How could a people endure such extremes with so little? And why had they remained so unknown, so utterly isolated from the greater arcs of South American history? The Yagan weren't builders of great cities, nor were they known for writing or metallurgy. Their legacy was one of adaptation, of survival at the edge of the world. They spoke a language with complex grammar and vocabulary that could articulate nuanced ideas of space movement and emotion. In fact, the word Mamikla Pinatape, which comes from the Yagan language, is often cited as one of the hardest to translate. A shared glance between two people, each wishing the other would initiate something they both desire but are hesitant to begin. This poetic subtlety stands in stark contrast to the harshness of their environment, and perhaps it's this tension that makes the Yagan so mysterious. By the 20th century, most anthropologists considered the Yagunan a vanishing culture. Dwindled by disease, colonization, and assimilation, the last full-blooded Yagun woman, Christina Calderon, passed away in 2022. With her, the language once carried only by oral tradition seemed to fade into silence. But even in death, the Yagan defy closure for one oral histories among the surviving mixed heritage communities. Speak of clans that left before the missionaries arrived, those who vanished deeper into the channels far beyond even the most remote settlements. Could isolated groups still survive in those uncharted labyrinths of fjords and islands, hidden by the impenetrable weather and nearly impossible terrain? It's not as implausible as it sounds. The Fagian archipelago is a place of secrets. There are islands that have never been surveyed, and channels where satellite signals falter. Expeditions still report unrecorded flora and unfamiliar animal behaviors in such places. Human footprints could be swallowed whole by moss and snow within a day, and there are hints, fragments that suggest not all has been lost. In 2004, researchers conducting a remote environmental survey found the remnants of what appeared to be a canoe partially submerged in a hidden cove. No modern village was nearby, and the structure was too intact, too deliberately placed to be a forgotten artifact. Who had built it? When local fishermen have spoken in hushed tones about strange fires seen flickering at night on distant shores, far from any known habitation. Faint smoke columns where no trails lead. Even cryptic artifacts, woven baskets, stone tools have surfaced from caves and beaches with no explanation as to who left them or when. Could some thread of the Yagan still survive in these isolated pockets? If not in blood, then perhaps in memory, in secret descendants who continue the rituals, language, or songs beneath the radar of the modern world. There are scholars who dismiss such ideas as romanticism, a projection of our own yearning for mystery, and yet history has shown us time and again that disappearance is rarely absolute. The assumption of extinction has often masked mere retreat. The Yagan way of life was never about visibility. It was about merging with the rhythms of land and sea, of adapting so completely to the environment that the boundary between people and place dissolves. To live like that is to leave little behind, but also perhaps to remain unseen by design. And so we are left with questions. Is it possible that in some fog-veiled inlet of Tierra del Fuego, a fire still burns for warmth alone? Not tourism or history, that a child still listens to an elder recite stories in a language shaped by wind and water, that perhaps in the coldest corners of the earth A sliver of the Yogan spirit survives, not frozen in time, but still evolving, still hiding, still out there. If so, then maybe the Yogan did not disappear at all. Maybe they simply returned to the silence that shaped them, waiting, watching, and reminding us that some civilizations, like the winds of the south, are not lost only out of reach. The wind moves gently. We stay in the mountains, but move forward in time into a different type of vanishing as the Carpathian hills flutter the imagined banners of the Agatha. This is the world of the Lemko people, whose villages once dotted the ridgelines of southeast Poland. It is not one sealed by ancient conquest or buried beneath centuries of soil, but rather one that vanished, written in memory, exiled and silently. Our path now winds deeper into the Carpathians through misted valleys, pine-covered slopes, and wooden churches tucked into folds of forgotten land. Slovakia's northeast and Ukraine's west, an ethereal borderland where cultures met but never quite merged. Much of that land is now quiet, with crumbling cottages peeking through overgrown thickets and carved wooden grave markers leaning beneath moss and snow. The names on old maps have faded, but if you listen closely, the echo of a distinct identity still lingers in the wind. Who were the Lemurs? At first glance, they appear to be one of many small Slavic ethnic groups in Eastern Europe. But the more you dig, the more elusive the truth becomes. The Lemos speak an East Slavic dialect, which some call a variety of Ukrainian, while others see it as a language of its own. Their churches adhere to the Byzantine Catholic tradition, but they are neither fully Orthodox nor Catholic, sacred. Groves and songs that speak to the cycles of earth and sky. Their architecture too is distinct, 3 domed wooden churches, painted in rich greens and blues, unlike any other in Europe. Their embroidery patterns are geometric, sometimes similar to motifs seen in ancient Scythian art. Their stories often center on wandering saints, enchanted mountains, and beings that watch from the forest. But perhaps what makes the Limos most mysterious is not just what they left behind, but the way they vanished for centuries. The Lemos lived in relative isolation, forming tight-knit highland communities across the Carpathian Arc. They were farmers, shepherds, and craftspeople. They weathered the rise and fall of empires from the Austro-Hungarian crown to the shifting borders of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Ukraine. But it was not until the 20th century that the rupture came following World War II. Under the shadow of political paranoia and ethnic reshuffling, the Lemos were targeted during Operation Vistula, a mass forced relocation carried out by the Polish Communist government in 1947, accused of harboring Ukrainian separatist sentiment. Over 140,000 Lemos and other Ukrainians were torn from their ancestral lands and resettled in scattered regions across the western and northern parts of Poland, often in areas recently vacated by Germans. The disruption was total. Families were separated, language was lost, sacred sites were abandoned, and yet something remained in the decades since. Scholars, linguists, and descendants have begun to trace the outlines of a culture that never fully disappeared. Songs from exile that recall mountain crossings that were never seen again. There are legends among the Limos themselves that they are not like the surrounding peoples, that their blood is older, quieter, drawn from some earlier source. For example, some historians classify the Lemos as part of the Rousing family, Eastern Slavs who settled the Carpathians during the medieval period, while others suggest they descend from an even older lineage, possibly merging with early Slavic settlers as they moved through the mountains. Folk tales passed down in kitchens describe a time when the land itself breathed, and in recent years there has been a quiet return of Lemko festivals. Scholars have observed that some Lemko songs seem to encode astronomical knowledge, phases of the moon solstices, alignments with local peaks, Could these be remnants of a spiritual system that predates Christianization, preserved in layers so subtle they've gone unnoticed for centuries? Even more intriguingly, archaeological surveys of old Lemko cemeteries and abandoned homesteads have uncovered artifacts whose origins are difficult to place. Some stories even mention forest ancestors who taught them how to live in harmony with the hills. And there are strange hints in some Lemko villages. Are these remnants of an earlier Carpathian civilization, or indications of a cultural memory much deeper than we currently comprehend? Perhaps the most perplexing question of all is whether the bronze amulets, bird-shaped talismans, and pottery styles don't obviously fit neighboring traditions. The Carpathians remain vast, and in many places sparsely populated deep valleys remain untouched by modern infrastructure. Some have speculated that small, isolated Lemko communities may have survived the deportations hidden in the folds of the mountains, speaking their dialect in whispers, practicing their rites in secret. There are occasional stories from hikers or foresters of hearing unfamiliar chants in abandoned churches, of encountering elders who speak a language not quite Polish, not quite Ukrainian. Could these be the remnants of a lost civilization still flickering at the edges of modernity? The Lemko story is not one of collapse, but of quiet endurance. A people carved from stone and mist, displaced, forgotten, but never fully gone. And as the mountain fog curls once more around the forests of the Besided Range, we're left to wonder what else sleeps in the silence of the Carpathians. What memories still walk the wooded paths in bodies we no longer recognize? The Limos may still be out there, not vanished but hidden, waiting, as ever, in the shadow of the pines. And as the quiet shadows of the Carpathians settle behind us, where the Lemko spirit still drifts, stone silence of Dempt lingers beneath the highland skies of Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. We move now across deserts and ancient battlefields to a place where history and myth intertwine, with eerie precision, to a land of sacred valleys and forgotten cities where memory clings not only to the ruins but to the shadows. They cast welcome to the realm of the Rephaim, mentioned in ancient texts with a strange, almost fearful reverence. The Reem are a people, or perhaps something more spoken of in the Hebrew Bible and other ancient Near Eastern records. Their name is often translated as giants, shades, or spirits of the dead. Yet, these interpretations are uncertain, for while the Rephaim are sometimes cast as mythic beings elsewhere, they appear as historical actors, rulers of cities, lords of the underworld, remnants of a forgotten race. Could they have once been real? And if so, what happened to them? To begin understanding the mystery, we must look to the landscape of Bashan, a high plateau in modern-day southern Syria and northern Jordan. Large fields of megalithic ruins, including enormous stone circles, dolmens, and underground chambers, can be found in this area, rich in volcanic soil and ancient trade routes. Among these is Rujam el-Hiri, a sprawling monument of concentric stone rings that dates back to at least 3000 BC and is frequently referred to as the Stonehenge of the Levant. Its original purpose is unknown, but some locals call it an astronomical observatory, tomb temple, or something else. Gilgal Rephaim, the circle of the Remaraim, is mentioned in the Bible as ancient inhabitants of the land before the Israelites arrived. In the book of Deuteronomy, they are described as giants, a people great and numerous and tall, and their most famous king Og of Bashan is said to have ruled over 60 fortified cities, with a bed that is over 13 feet long. However, even this odd detail raises questions about whether it is a metaphor or a memory, before being assimilated or killed by later forces. Some experts think the reef may have been a genuine tribe or confederation of peoples that were tall, maybe genetically unique and culturally prominent in the area. Their reference in several ancient texts, including as Genesis, Joshua, and to Samuel, implies that they were regarded as a lost civilization that was both feared and respected, rather than as a myth. Archaeological evidence from the area provides some intriguing hints about Bashan. Hundreds of dolmens and large stone burial structures, many of which date to the early Bronze Age, are scattered along the hillsides. Some of these structures contain the skeletal remains of people who were noticeably taller than average for the time, while others have been found empty and carefully sealed. More oddly, some of these burial sites coincide with solar and lunar events, suggesting a cosmology far more advanced than expected for a presumed pastoral or tribal culture. Could this be evidence of priest-kings of a lost theological system, or of a civilization whose knowledge, like its name, was later obscured? Some traditions suggest the Rephaim were not simply mortal kings, but divine beings, offspring of gods and humans, or survivors of an earlier antediluvian world. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text excluded from most biblical canons, speaks of giants born from the union of the Watchers and the daughters of men, beings who corrupted the earth. Before the great flood, after their destruction, the spirits of these giants, it is said, became the restless dead, the Rephaim. Could this be mythologized memory, a narrative, built around a real but misunderstood people? And what of the name itself, the Hebrew root Rapha means to heal or to release, but in its plural form Riam, it comes to denote the shades of the dead in Ugaritic texts from ancient Syria. The Rapoma are described as ancestral spirits, kings of old who dwell in the underworld but are invoked in sacred rituals. Could the Rephaim have originally been the deified ancestors of a vanished elite, later transformed in folklore into ghosts, giants, or demons over time? The identity of the Rephaim blurs, bleeding into both history and myth, but their traces endure in stone circles buried under dust, in names etched on forgotten maps, in the uncanny similarity between tombs in Bashan and other megalithic cultures across the Mediterranean. Some fringe theories go further, linking the Rephaim with broader Eurasian traditions of giant kings or lost hybrid dynasties. Others see them as the last remnants of a pre-flood civilization, one erased from surface memory but preserved in architecture and scripture. These interpretations remain unproven, but they point to a central question: why do so many cultures preserve stories of giants, of ancient ones who ruled and then vanished perhaps? The Reem were not giants of stature, but giants of memory, figures so culturally dominant, so spiritually potent, that later civilizations could not fully erase them, so they reclassified them as legends, as monsters, as gods. But the ruins still remain, and in the highlands of Bashan, beneath basalt hills and starlit skies, the stones continue to guard their secrets. Who were the Reem? A forgotten people, a priestly caste, something more. And if the stories are even partially true, if even one thread of memory is accurate, could a trace of them still exist in hidden chambers, in undiscovered texts, in bloodlines no longer named? The land has not forgotten, the stones still remember, and the Rephaim may yet wait silent beneath the earth. And as the basalt tombs of Bashan fade into shadow, mist-covered cliffs, the memory of their vanished people suspended in mid-air, we turn now to a quieter mystery, one not carved into rock, but hidden in the folds of language, in the forested borderlands between India and Myanmar, a mystery of voices, half forgotten, of ancestral knowledge, wrapped in syllables no longer spoken aloud. This is the story of the Luish, a cultural enigma whose presence flickers faintly in the linguistic record like echoes across a ravine. The terrain itself tells us something. Thick jungle stretches over the rolling hills of western Myanmar and northeastern India's Chin and Arunachal Pradesh regions. It is a land of cloud forests, bamboo groves and winding rivers, remote and layered with centuries of human settlement lost beneath its canopy. Within these hills once lived a people we now call Luish, a name not tied to a political kingdom or monumental ruin, but to a forgotten linguistic branch of the Tibeto-Burman family, their language now spoken fluently only in fragments by a handful of aging individuals, is the last whisper of a culture. We scarcely understand the Luish. Languages also known as the Asakian group once spread across this region in a faint arc, leaving behind linguistic traces in small isolated pockets. The most prominent of these are Sak and Kadu, still spoken today by dwindling communities in northern Myanmar. These languages share roots with ancient Tibet-Burman forms, but their grammar and vocabulary contain anomalies, structures not easily explained by known regional linguistic evolution. Were the Luish an offshoot of a larger migration, or something older independent, perhaps even a holdover from a pre-Tibeto-Burman substratum? There is no clear answer. What we do know is this: by the time the Luish people have no known written tradition, no surviving temples or cities bear their names. Their collected stories speak of flight, forgotten wars, villages burned, and rivers crossed. Some describe ancestral homelands far to the northwest now inaccessible. Others suggest that they were once part of a much larger web of forest tribes that were later divided and assimilated into neighboring cultural identities. British colonial scholars began documenting regional languages in the 19th century, and the Luish tongues were already endangered. But what little that has survived suggests a more widespread past. In 2019, linguists working in northern Myanmar reported discovering an undocumented dialect that bore striking similarities to both Kadu and Sak, but also contained entirely unique words, possibly relics from an even older stage of the language. Local elders claimed they had inherited it from ancestors who came from the Sky Mountains. What's left are patchwork songs remembered without meaning, place names no longer recognized, and an identity hanging by a thread. But the mystery still exists. A lyrical expression that might allude to highland areas that are currently unreachable by living Luish speakers, where they may be the remnants of a vanished subgroup that has survived centuries of conflict despite being cut off and isolated. Archaeological sites in the neighboring Chin and Naga regions are considerably more fascinating. Researchers hypothesize that hilltop settlements with megaliths, petroglyphs, and stone alignments whose builders are still unknown may have been early Luish settlements, although they lack inscriptions or other obvious cultural indicators. The link remains uncertain. Unlike great empires, whose disappearance leaves behind shattered cities and toppled statues, the Luish left little for archaeologists to unearth. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps their civilization was never centralized, never monument building, but rather rooted in something more ephemeral: knowledge, past orally relationships, mapped by kinship and memory rather than stone. A forest civilization designed to vanish into its surroundings when threatened, and perhaps that is what it did. Some anthropologists now believe that the Luish were among the earliest forest-dwelling peoples to be pushed aside by the spread of agriculture and larger state formations in the early 1st millennium AD. As powerful polities rose along the Irrawaddy and Brahmaputra rivers, the Luish people may have retreated further into the highlands, splintering, adapting, forgetting their name, but keeping fragments of their culture alive in language, ritual, and story, which raises a haunting possibility. What if the Luish haven't disappeared at all? What if they continue to exist as an unacknowledged thread woven through the identities of other groups? their presence concealed in plain sight, like a child greeting the sun with a lullaby in the form of a ceremonial offering made in a clearing of a forest. The Luwish may not offer us ruins or royal lineages, but in the subtle persistence of their language, in the living breath of a dialect almost forgotten, they may still be telling a story the world has not fully heard. In the quiet highlands between nations, where the canopy hides more than it reveals, the question lingers. Linguists working in the region today still come across words and grammar, structures with no clear origin features that don't fit surrounding languages. Could these be linguistic fossils, remnants of Luwish influence preserved in unexpected places? If so, how far did the Luwish culture once reach? Have the Luwish indeed vanished, or have they only evolved into the quiet that exists between words? Sakhalin is a spot of haunting beauty and forgotten sounds that lies over volcanic islands and over pine-covered cliffs where the sea breathes mist. The Anu are a mysterious people whose origins are as mysterious as the island itself, although they are often associated with Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, for centuries or even millennia. They inhabited a much wider territory from the northern tip of Honshu to the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin in the north. Their presence once traced a forgotten arc across the boundary between Asia and the Pacific, and Sakhalin in particular holds their deeper mysteries. The skies here remain heavy with silence, the forests are ancient, and the earth even now seems to whisper of lives once deeply intertwined with the spirits of mountain rivers and bears. The island, now part of the Russian Federation, is a vast and remote landmass stretching over 600 meters in length. Its interior is rugged and heavily forested. Its coastlines are jagged and storm-lashed. Even today, parts of Sakhalin remain largely unexplored. And it was here, hidden among the rivers and forests, that a unique branch of the Innu thrived, one that developed independently from their Hokkaido relatives, shaped by the rhythms of a harsher, colder world. But who were they really, linguistically? The Ainu language stands apart from any known language family. It is an isolate with no proven relation to Japanese, Korean, or any other language in East Asia. Some have speculated links to Paleo-Siberian tongues or even distant echoes of ancient Indo-European migrations. Though none of these claims have been confirmed, the mystery deepens with the realization that the Ainu themselves do not record a moment of origin. Their stories speak not of arrival, but of emergence, of always having been part of the land genetically too. Their distinct studies suggest that the Ainu carry a large percentage of Jon ancestry, the Jon being a prehistoric people who lived in Japan as far back as 1400 BC. Some anthropologists believe that the Ainu may represent one of the oldest continuous cultural lineages in the region, their traditions forming a living bridge to a world before written history. And yet, in Sakhalin, that continuity has been nearly erased during the 19th and 20th centuries' waves of colonization. First by the Russian Empire, then by the Japanese, disrupted the ancient lifeways, forced resettlements. Cultural suppression and assimilation policies fractured their communities. By the mid-9th century, the Sakhalin Ainu had been declared extinct on paper, but the mountains don't keep records, and neither do the rivers. Recent years have seen a quiet resurgence of interest, genealogical traces in local families' isolated dialect, fragments, and above all memory. There are communities in Sakhalin's remote villages who still recall bear ceremonies, who speak of grandfathers that refused to cut their hair in the old Anu style, and of lullabies sung in a tongue now considered dead. Is it possible that the Sakhalin Ainu were never truly erased, but merely went quiet? And if so, could some of them still live today? Not as a visible, organized nation, but as an invisible lineage, hiding in plain sight within Russian or Niv identities waiting for the right moment to remember who they are. There is precedent in Japan. The Anu were long declared a vanished people, only to be formally recognized again as indigenous in 2008. That resurgence came not from archaeological discovery but from within, from families choosing to reclaim names, language and rituals long suppressed. Could the same happen in Sakhalin? There are reasons to believe the past may not be as far away as we think. In 2019, researchers conducting linguistic fieldwork along the Tim River discovered a few elderly individuals who could recall fragments of prayers in an unrecognized dialect, possibly a Creole of Onu and Naive, a custom from Hokkaido that is believed to be gone in Sakhalin, is described by one woman as including the raising of a bear cub in the home and its ceremonial release. More hints are found in the natural surroundings along Sakhalin's rivers. Archaeologists have found earthen fortresses, petroglyphs, and burial mounds with features not entirely aligned with either Russian or Naive cultural histories. Some of these may belong to the Okhotsk culture, a maritime people thought to have interacted with, or even evolved into the northern Anu, but the exact relationship remains unresolved. Could these traces be evidence of a Sakhalin-Anu continuum? A forgotten cultural threat extending from prehistory to the present, simply hidden by war border shifts and the silence of survival? Or could the Sakhalin-Anu have taken their knowledge deeper into the wilderness, retreating into the forests as they had done before, keeping their traditions intact in secret? The vastness of Sakhalin offers cover its interior remains, one of the least documented areas in Northeast Asia. Could there be small communities that chose not to re-emerge? We may never know for certain, but what's clear is that the story of the Anu is far from over. It is not only one of loss, but of endurance, of identities folded into others, of voices soft, but not silent. And so we are left with a question that echoes along the banks of the Tim howling winds of the Tiger. If the Innu of Sakhalin still remember who they are, will the world remember to listen? And if we listen closely enough, past the borders and the silence, what else might still be out there, waiting to be heard? Far beyond the eastern shores of New Zealand, where the roll across the steppes of Central Asia are ancient. They move with the weight of forgotten migrations, sweeping through the deserts of Xinjiang, over the Pamir Mountains, and into the highlands of Bactria. Somewhere along these shifting trails of time, the memory of a lost people lingers, faint, elusive, yet never fully erased. They were called the Uedi. Little survives of their own voice, no city, ruins marked with their name, no known written language, and yet their influence echoes across centuries of Asian history like a shadow just out of reach. The story begins somewhere in the grasslands of Gansu, Western China, around the 2nd millennium BC. A pastoral, possibly Indo-European people known as the Yugi thrived here, hurting animals, trading jade, and living in the crossroads between the rising Chinese dynasties and the wild unknown to the west. Chinese records later described them as prosperous and powerful riders of fine horses, clad in felt and fur, dwelling in mobile camps. That shifted with the seasons, but in the 2 North century BC, everything changed. A powerful nomadic empire. The Xiongnu rose in the north. The Yui were defeated, their leader killed, and their skull reportedly turned into a drinking cup. One group, known as the Lesser Yui, fled south into Tibet and eventually disappeared from history as the Confederation was split apart by war. The other group, known as the Greater Yui, started a slow, epic migration across the roof of the world. But where did they go, and what did they become? The trail resumes. By the 1st century BC, the Yui had overrun the remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom in Bactria, a fertile mountain region that straddles present-day Afghanistan and Tajikistan. This strong dynasty would go on to rule much of Central Asia and northern India for centuries, serving as a crucial link along the Silk Road. Under the Kushans, the cities flourished, and coinage featuring the faces of rulers like Kishka the Great spread across empires. Buddhist art flourished in Gandhara, fusing Indian patterns with Hellenistic techniques to create a syncretic beauty that is still studied today. Greek Sanskrit writings also flourished. Speaking Bactrian and Prakrit, Buddhism spread northward, into Central Asia and then into China and Tibet with the help of Kushan patronage. However, the Kusans fell as quickly as they rose, and by the 3rd century AD they had split into regional powers that invaded groups like the Sassanids and Hephthalites. Later, the Huns overran their lands, and the empire faded into memory. Once more, the Uai disappeared into the annals of history, or did they? What makes the Wechi so fascinating is not just what we know, but what is still unknown. Where did the Wechi originate before they were mentioned in Chinese records? Were they a single people or a group of tribes? Their name may have survived in fragments, possibly in the Tocharians, whose well-preserved mummies in the Turam Basin have European features, or in the Jot communities of India and Pakistan, who claim ancestry from Central Asian tribes. Links between Indo-European languages and woolen garments. The mystery grows when we consider how little archaeology has revealed about the Ugi compared to the Han or Parthians. The Ugi left behind few cities, no large monuments, and nearly no inscriptions in their own language. The majority of what we know about them comes from outside Chinese historians. Some scholars have proposed a connection between the Ugi and these early inhabitants, but it is still speculative. There is a tantalizing possibility that some remnant of the Wechi may still exist, hidden in the Central Asian highlands, preserved within the cultural fabric of a forgotten valley tribe, or buried in the untranslated verses of obscure Buddhist texts. Their legacy may not be in ruins, but rather in stories passed down through generations about wanderers who came from the east with horses, trade, and the promise of peace in the remote valleys of the Pamir Mountains. Roman accounts, and later, Buddhist texts make it seem as though the Ui lived through history like ghosts present, influential, but never quite certain. Some groups continue to mention distant ancestors who brought odd practices and holy knowledge with them when they moved from unidentified countries. Although genetic research in the area has shown characteristics that are consistent with ancient Indo-European inhabitants, no definitive language has been unearthed that provides shards of Ars with so much of the Ugi legacy. There are a few root words here and grammatical echo there, but the hints are still just out of reach. In addition, the land itself is enormous, unexplored, and always changing. Central Asia is a region where the desert can hold secrets for millennia and mountains may conceal entire histories. Fresh findings every few years, coins, tablets, and frescoes appear, adding another layer to the mystery of the Ugi. However, the entire story has not been written, leaving us to wonder, did the Ui really disappear, swallowed up by the tides of empires and migrations? Or is their story still being told beneath the layers of time and dust, waiting for us to look in the right place and listen intently enough to see the invisible footprints of a civilization that moved with the wind? If they are still there, buried in memory, or subtly woven into the lives of their descendants, what might they still have to teach us about the resilience of migration and the enduring power of identity? As the golden sun sets, the wind continues to carry their name across the steppes, but there is only quiet in response.